So here you go. It's a good morning to us, everybody in Europe, and a good evening to us and everybody in Japan. And I don't think anybody's joining us from this in North America or this. Anyway, we had a wonderful session yesterday, although this is short, but we had plenty of some wonderful papers. And then yesterday, this panel was divided by geography. So we had the three panels. So one is about Japanese cinema, and the second panel is about Europeans, and then the third one is about Chinese. So today we have only two panels. But then the first one is, and of course, today so we're not dividing also the panel by geography, but by some themes. So the first panel is about some film productions and then the consumptions. And then the second panel is mainly about politics and the geopolitics, and then also there's an identity. So I can you can now expect this is going to be a wonderful morning or evening again. And then also I mentioned this yesterday. So as you can see, we have 13 or 14 in the papers over 2 days. We first invited about 20, just over 20 people, and then 18 people responded, to participate in this workshop. Unfortunately, because of this travel restrictions, and then format is turned from in presence to online. So a few people couldn't join this workshop. But still, I'm very, very pleased, and so many people really participating very actively and in the given paper. Okay, so let's hope so we won't have any technical problem. This is the main worry when you have this conference and the workshop online, but let's hope we have these wonderful technicians in Brussels, so that then there shouldn't be having any problems. But let's hope we can complete this this wonderful morning or wonderful evening without much problem. And then of course we expect lots of good the papers, and then also a good discussion. Okay, so here we are. Shall I give the floor to Vanessa? She's going to chair all these session of panels today. So Vanessa.
Thank you very much, Professor Morita. So my name is Vanessa Frangville, and I'm going to have the pleasure to chair all two panels this morning. So we're starting at 9:15, so exactly on time. That's perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you for following us as well. So each speaker has 25 minutes, and I'm going to be a very boring and very strict clock. So I'm going to measure time so that everyone has the same time to speak. So we're starting with Professor Electra VENAKI.
Yeah. Hello, thank you.
So we're going full screen.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for calling me. Thank you for having me here. So my presentation focuses on European co-production schemes in Greece, a low production capacity country, and their effect in film form and style. I investigate the changes and I believe compromises on artistic issues that direct and producers from small cinemas, such as a Greek cinema, ought or not to undertake in order to finalize a co-production with a robust film industry, European film industry, responding especially at their expectations from countries of the periphery. I focus on the sound post-production phase, where co-production find quite often an artistically anodyne arrangement, let's say, between partners. Let's briefly summarize some start for Greece. Greece benefits from all the European tools for co-production from their beginning as a Western European country, and benefits also from the Southeastern European Cinema Network, founded in 2000 for the Balkan countries and Cyprus, for the reason they were obliged to call it Southeastern instead of Balkan. And between 2014 and 2018, from a specific French-Greek agreement between film centers. This agreement boosts a lot Greece European co-production. The particularity with Greece regarding pan-European and regional funds and co-production is it plays on the map. That's the problem. From the one side, as you can see, it borders with Italy, one of the 5 big cinema industries, and on the other hand, bordered communist countries until late 80s, with which it wasn't very easy to produce at that moment. In this table, you can see when the other Balkan countries entered the ERIMAS program. So the major official ERIMAS co-production for Greek films for many years were mostly with France and with Bulgaria and Turkey, the only Balkan members of ERIMAS at that time. Oh, sorry. Here. The major official ERIMAS, okay, around mid-90s, 2000, co-production started to become an industrial imperative for the post-communist countries too. Greece, the only non-ex-communist country of the Balkans, faced different reasons, very similar problems. So their common goal was to co-produce with the West in order to secure a decent budget, and Western co-producers facilitate the access to European funds and offer more exhibition windows, hence better visibility and accessibility in A-class festival. And since 2010, a new generation of directors and producers for all Balkan countries almost, educated abroad or lived abroad, start change Balkan countries' co-production ecosystem. The important thing is that the beginning of ERIMAS coincides with the advent of digital sound around the 90s. Here, I put it all with stereo too, but in Europe it was a little bit later. And the specificities of the multi-channel sound mix guided Balkan film industries to collaborate with sound studios and specialized crew from Western European countries, since they had the infrastructure and an already well-established workflow. So Western producers started to offer the multi-channel sound post-production as their part of contribution to a co-production project. Greece at that moment had already invested to the needed technological infrastructure, and some co-production with Serbia and Turkey were based on Greek post-production facilities. But as I already mentioned, Balkan countries were and are looking always at the West. An important number of those Balkan co-productions cede sound post-production to a Western minor co-producer, considering these artistic tasks just technical. And for that reason, they found their place, as you know, in the end credits of the film. They are below the line tasks, as we say. Indeed, sound post-production is often considered just a technical task. Excuse me, no. There is a broadly accepted assumption that sound does not solicit any field of aesthetic or narrative quest, but it's a technicality, a self-explanatory and realistic necessity, not only for the scholarship that you know that maybe, but for the producers too. So, co-production considers sound post-production as a nanodyne artistic concession. That's very important to the minor co-producer, and the minor co-producers is the Western big industry. But soundscapes are strongly related with the geographical and cultural specificities. And the soundtrack, so, is a strongly culturally and geographically identified film element. The problem is with this co-production, a financial really co-production turns to be an artistic one with very doubtful results on the end. We have a problem that beside the huge difference in labor cost between big and small film industries that affect the overall budget, this practice in long term has, as a result, the decrease of the value and sustainability of the production industry in small countries in favor of Western film industries, and that it's very important. On the other hand, if we follow the line of Jordanova saying that postulates similarities in the narrative cinematographic approach in Balkan cinema, I propose to extend it to the use of sound. Balkan industries indeed share similar production costs, similar film state policies, always on the French model, similar production practices, of course, similar film production and post-production practices too. But above all, Balkan filmmakers share auditory culture, which form unique memories and cultural references. Soundscapes full of music, musicalized sounds, and voices, very important, are quite similar in this region of Europe, a fact that shapes accordingly the auditory perception of the perceiver, audio viewers, and citizens, of course. They face, of course, similar language and cultural barriers. Furthermore, in subtitling cultures such as Greece, it's a subtitling culture country, the voice is not considered only as the bearer of the meaningful speech, very important, but it's unconsciously perceived as a sound element of the cinematic soundscape for its materiality, its tone, texture, pitch, adding to the effect of the scene. National cinema goers are conditioned to enjoy more the verbal rhythm of the voice, its instrumentality, its materiality, and they are aware of and accustomed to these different sonorities of their soundscapes when they become creators. Sorry. Is the next? Okay. European, and before I'm going to this famous phrase, European film, as you know, are still discussed when it's about style and form as visual oeuvres, film text, instead of film events, in the line of recalcment, leaving sound production and perception out of the equation. That is to say, along with the filmmakers of their generation, Greek and the Balkan directors, work with given conditions offered by their environment, their nationality, film production and distribution restrictions, and labor practices paired with influence of cultural, historical, and technological factors. So, guided by Safra's well-known saying that individuals and societies of various historical eras and various geographical ones, I add, listen differently, the following hypothesis is on play. If individuals and societies listen differently, their artists create their soundscapes differently. Thus, the auditory culture of its country interferes in the final result, and the growing of European co-production changed the way we hear, all of us, and apprehend visual spaces in transnational film. The ease with which producers seed the final mix to a Western robust cinema industry involves the risk of resulting in a new form of auditory, let's say, Euro thing. here I put, I will not read all of them, but it's very important that European co-production schemes such as Norimasa are not without the risk of homogenization due to Western European dominant aesthetics. Many researchers talk about that. I put small phrases, and I would like only to read this of Hedendorf because I think it's very important. Certain nationalism, cultural ideas and interpretations are more transnationally powerful, assertive and successful from others. Of course, it's not only the names that they put here, and Caesar, George, and many people, many researchers point out this event. So there is with small cinemas producers and unfortunately sometimes directors see the final mix and even where's the sound editing to a Western raw stuff cinema. Sorry. I told this. And so this reaction can have as a result, in the best case scenario, the good interaction and mutual cultural exchange between the Western film sound mixer and the director. But in the worst case scenario, the unique soundscape become a pan-European or even West, a globalized version of normal sounds of cities and rural areas based on sound cliché, easily founded sound libraries that everybody use in the sound post-production in the world. In some cases, of course, we have some succeeded cases. This film where a foreigner sound editor or mixer doesn't speak in old Greek or other small nation language, but this is not much an obstacle. For instance, in this co-production, was the 445, a Greek-German-Israeli co-production, all the sound editing and the mix will take place in Jerusalem. Israel was a minor. But this film belongs rather to a neo-noir genre, a dystopian city where the soundscapes are not meant to be locally identified. They rather alluded to cultural specific genre film references. We should add here that the cost of the sound post-production in Israel are similar with Greece. It was financially viable too. That means that the director lived there for a month during all the post-production. There are also other very successful transnational relation and interaction which justify the cultural diversity so loudly proclaimed by European fans. And we can find in Turkish and Romanian films. For instance, Herden Ceylan works all the time with Thomas Robert de France, Pouy Radoujude Nezer works with the same sound mixer, Eric Chevalier, toujours en français, always in French. Greek production company works always with a sound mixer from Netherlands, and the Greek sound mixer, Kostas Veribubiotis, but he is a native German speaker, travels very often to Germany to mix the films there. But there are other films, more realistic ones, that they need to be treated differently. My case study is based on this film by Behind the Caskets. I was the film image and sound editor of the film. It's the first feature film of a young Greek director, Selina Proedrou. And it's a social family drama set in Dorian Lake, located at the border between Greece and North Macedonia in 2015, when hundreds of migrants tried to cross the borders illegally into Northern Europe. The plot follows a parallel narrative structure of a family in the village near the lake. For the visuals, I could be the three heroes. The first story is that of Stelios, a middle-aged fisherman and farmer, while the other two stories is his wife Maria and their daughter Anastasia. Behind the Caskets, it's a transnational Greek production with North Macedonia and Germany. North Macedonia was an artistic partner, as many sequences of the film have been shot in North Macedonia. Yes, it was in Dorian Lake. and Greek crew passed the borders. They needed assistance, of course, locations, actors, etc. The German minor co-producer, which he was supported by Arte, followed the co-financing model. That means they contribute only on money. Here I follow Lucia's Naguib definition of realistic cinema based on mode of production. Since 2016, while writing the script, the director visited several times regions. She stayed several days with the locals, shot by herself in migration camp, discussing with local traffic taxis because there has been illegal traffic, hotel owners, fishermen, etc., trying to reproduce the social and historical reality. As the most production in Greece, it's a very low budget production with small crew, tight shooting calendar, 4 weeks in Athens and 3 weeks of shooting in North Greece. All cast and crew lived there. All of the locations are near the lake, and all the sound of the film is based in the film recording. The music of in this film is diegetic. So here, the challenges we faced. During the pre-production, there had been a discussion with a French co-producer. The Greek production company worked very often with him. And in this project, the French part suggested to contribute to the sound post-production. The director and I strongly opposed to this idea, and the co-production with France became impossible. Ironically enough, without this cost, the sound post-production cost labor in studio in France are much higher than in Greece, with the same infrastructure and label studios. The financial plan of the film has become more realistic and feasible just with the contribution of the two other partners with whom Greek company applied very much. Our decision to undertake the sound post-production was based solely on aesthetic and practical issues. Aesthetic speaking, along with the landscapes, soundscapes mainly after mid-silent sound, became not only the main bearer of the continuity of time and space, but notably the provider nowadays of the bath of affect, to borrow Claudia's Gorman expression regarding just music, but many years ago in the monophonic cinema. For instance, the shooting of the home of the family was shot nearby Athens for production budget reasons. Our challenge was to combine the visual from the surrounding of Athens with sounds that belong to both cultural realities, this of the image and this of the imagined place of the narrative, the North Greek village. The importance of the film recording, all the film is based, all the sound of the film is based, the sound field recording, the manipulation during sound editing, sound mix of rare ambient sounds, unique for each location, as the rare beds we found in Trojan Lake, as the silent atmospheres that we can find only in vast landscapes in remote lands, drove us progressively to use the sounds captured in North Greece, adding some specific sounds from the village near Athens in order to mix the two spaces in one. On the other hand, the consecutive stories of the three heroes guided us to choose different sound words from each of them. Stereos is always submerged, and we see the scene of stereos, submerged by the radio news and an aggressive reality, and with sound overlapping, etc. that we did. Maria is surrounded by sound of the villages, voices, bells, animals, as is always in attention of her environment and what the people say. On the contrary, Anastasia, the young girl, is immersed into music, joy, desires, loud voices, etc. And of course, when we arrived at the spatialization, because it's a surround film, in the multi-channel final mix, the space we gave to each of them, it was totally different. All these long and always in progress procedures cannot be done if the sound editing would have been held after the image editing, which is the practice when we give the post-production in another country. Perfect. So now we can see an excerpt of the film. Arrêtez. C'est très bien. Le mouse. I'm sorry, it's always problematic. It's a surround film, and we'll see a non-color corrected version of the film and the stereo mix that I made a week ago alone for this presentation, because the film finished November. Play. Sorry. Can we? It's a little more jealous.
Γεια σου Γιώργο. Γεια σου Στέργιο.
Παρά τη μεγάλη στραματική απόδοση που παρατηρείται σχεδόν σε όλες τις περιοχές της χώρας μας, το οικονομικό διέξοδο των αγροτών φαίνεται αξεπέραστο.
Ahí vos. Libre.
Здраво, Serious. Kako je? Everything okay?
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Bye, Libre. Bye.
Bye, bye.
Интернет стои дека доколку сте нерасположени, а сакате да се навратите во некој момент од минатото, мирисот е првото нешто што може да ве врати назад и повторно музиката ги враќа спомените. Така што доколку има некоја песна што можеби вас ќе ве врати назад во времето, слободно пишете ни, кажете ни што е.
Bravo. Bravo, Serious. My friend. Ha. Chef. 6. Thank you. Hey, wait. Στην υγεία σου.
That's right.
Γεια.
Φαινόμενα ντόμινο προκάλεσε η απόφαση της Γερμανίας να κλείσει τα νότια σύνορα της χώρας, αναστέλλοντας προσωρινά τη συνθήκη του Σέγγεν. Το παράδειγμα του Βερολίνου ακολούθησαν η Αυστρία, η Ουγγαρία, η Σλοβενία, η Σλοβακία και στη συνέχεια η Κροατία και η Σερβία, εξωθώντας και τη γειτονική πρώην Ιουγκοσλαβική Δημοκρατία της Μακεδονίας να κάνει το ίδιο.
Well, there are many issues we can discuss about subtitling because we were obliged to add borders because the German people couldn't understand that we had all this control in the borders, and to put Macedonian language, etc. Oh,
Do you want
yes.
to switch to your presentation?
Yes. No,
No?
No.
Okay, sorry.
because I finished in 1 minute. As I told you, in co-production for budgetary reasons, it's not possible. It's not in this co-production, it's not possible the sound team in another country to work in parallel with the image editor in place. It's very expensive. And usually the film editing is just, as we say, locked before going to the phase of the sound. And so when we say that the image is locked, that means that we didn't take in consideration the changes in riff and pace that sounds provoke. And the sound team is obliged to work with a finalized, almost silent movie. Very often, in a trained ear and eye, we found many films where one can feel two independent narrations. I feel it in many co-productions and in many specific nationalities films because the labor problems they have, they divided the two works. This is of the image and this is of the sound, two different narratives. And we feel a kind of sonorized, silent moving image. And concluded, I postulate that it is not only technical and budgetary factors that affect the final soundscape of the film. And the praise of cultural diversity throughout co-production reaches sometimes its limit when these artistic tasks are held by some people, local or foreigners, without taking into consideration the spoken language specificities, sonic and music culture, and above all, sound and image editing and mixing practices in the local, albeit very usually small, cinema industry, and how they apprehend the film's sound world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for keeping with time. So we will move to the next speaker, Flora from the Université de Rennes, about China's films in the global market. We are uploading the PowerPoint.
Juste le mettre. Ah non, j'ai pas de partage. Sur le Zoom. Là, sur écran partagé. Non, mais vert. Oui. Et là, c'est ça. Et là, tu peux mettre un diaporama.
Hello, thanks for having me today. So today I will be talking about Chinese independent cinema. So in the early 2000s, digital cameras appeared in China, thereby allowing filmmakers to shoot films alone outside state-funded studios. These films were called independent films and were selected and awarded at international film festivals, but were not allowed to be released in Chinese commercial distribution networks. So this presentation will focus on two Chinese independent documentary films that were produced by Chinese and European firms. And I will try to answer the question how co-production has changed the way in which these two Chinese filmmakers make films. So the first film is Bitter Money, a feature-length documentary film made in 2017. The film follows 3 young migrants who work in the garment industry in the city close to Shanghai. So the film has been presented as Chinese because its director is Chinese. One being, it was entirely shot in China. It features only Chinese characters and there is no transnational story. So when I say the film has been presented, it is mainly in the media. The film has also been presented as independent because there was no commercial distribution in China due to state censorship. And the film has been produced by Chinese and European production companies. two French companies, Gladys Glover and House on Fire, one French company based in Hong Kong, Chinese Shadows, one company from Luxembourg, and a last one from the Netherlands. The second film, A Young Patriot, is also a feature-length documentary film made in 2015. So in this film, during 5 years, the director followed a young adult who considers himself as a patriot and begins gradually to question the relevance of the Chinese Communist Party. So the film, in the same way as Bitter Money, has been presented as Chinese for the same reason. The director is also Chinese, Du Haiping, and the film has also been presented as independent because it didn't pass state censorship. And finally, has also been produced by a French and a Chinese private company. So although these films are presented as Chinese, it is interesting to note that most funding actually comes from European sources. So I'm not going to comment the whole table, but just quickly to show you that for Bitter Money and Shanghai Youth, which is the second part of Bitter Money, all funding came from European countries, apart from here, the initial investment from the Chinese production company. And for A Young Patriot, most funding came from France, the USA, and there is only an initial investment from the Chinese private company Cinex. So Bitter Money and A Young Patriot both establish a narrative that focuses on a nationally homogeneous setting, although having been mainly funded by European production companies and funding schemes. So one can wonder here, what does it mean for a Chinese film to be produced by European funding schemes, and why European production companies and funding schemes are they willing to finance Chinese films? So if we look at academic literature on the topic, we can say that basically most researchers agree on the fact that European funding schemes produce and reproduce a kind of Orientalism. If we take the example of the Hubert Balk's funds, which is attached to the International Film Festival Rotterdam, that appears here and here as well. I quote here Saldana, who says that the fund encourages projects that explores expressions of locality, cultural specificity, and nationhood. This is especially true if one takes for granted that the scheme, as well as considering artistic quality and market feasibility, is interested in funding projects that explore authenticity and which are rooted in the country of the applicant, even though most of the films funded are co-produced with northern countries. The fund supports works from directors who live and work in Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, and parts of Eastern Europe, regions classified by Hubert Balk's fund as being in development or in which the freedom of the press is considered low. So Saldana goes on to say that, I quote, the Hubert Balk's fund leads filmmakers to conceive works based on authorization to reinforce third world stereotypes related to underdevelopment. And Hal also argues that, I quote, the co-production strategy thus runs the risk of instituting a cycle of Orientalism, offering Euro-American audiences tales they want to hear about people fundamentally different from themselves, keeping as distant strangers people who live around the corner or down the hall. So if we come back to our case study, we could argue that Bitter Money and A Young Patriot fall in this category. That is to say, films that explore cultural specificity and nationhood and a form of authenticity, And also, even though they have been produced within northern countries and made by directors who work and live in Asia, albeit Wang Bing, the director of Peter Money, has recently settled in Paris, and China, which can be considered probably not now as a country being in development, but in which the freedom of the press is considered low. Sorry. So here the idea would be to say that for these films, European funding schemes are viewed as an extension of neo-colonial support mechanisms. And in this context, some researchers have argued that filmmakers from the global south might be directly or indirectly encouraged to temper their creative practices that aim of favoring festival audiences. So the next question is, has co-production changed the way in which Wang Bing and Du Haibin make films, and how? So if we look now at the two filmographies of the two filmmakers, we can see that they both started to make independent documentary films in the same period, in the early 2000s. So Wang Bing first made West of the Tracks, which is a pretty well-known documentary film now. So for this film, he was a director, the camera operator. He was also the producer, the editor, the sound, not the sound editor, sorry. And he worked with another Chinese producer for the first edition version, Chinese editor, and for the second version, with the thanks to the fund of the Uber Bags, with a British editor, and also with two Chinese sound editors. And he produced the film himself and got an additional funding with the Uber Bags fund. The context of production is alike for Crude Oil, Coal Money, Man with No Name. And so here we don't have all his films, but I mean, his main feature-length documentary films. Here, the context has changed a little bit. So Wang Bing is still the director. He's working with other camera operators, 2 to 4 Chinese camera operators, including himself. For the editing, he's still part of the editing process, but he's working now with an European editor. I said an European editor because it has changed in his different films, plus a Chinese assistant who is mainly here for language translation, according to Wang Bing. And also is working with 1 to 3 Chinese and or European sound editors, and all these films have been co-produced by European and Chinese companies. So for Three Sisters, France, Switzerland, and Germany. For Team Madness, USA Part, Hong Kong, France, and Japan. For Town, Hong Kong, and France. For Mrs. Fong, France, China, and Germany. And for Dead Souls, France, and Switzerland. So we can see that all these films have been produced and edited by European partners from the very beginning, and Bitter Money is no exception. We can see, however, a slight evolution 10 years after his career, when Wang Bing has systematically co-productions with more partners, and also systematically one European editor, Chinese assistants, etc. for editing. But we have to say that Wang Bing is an exception, I would say, in the international scene, because most Chinese independent filmmakers are more like Du Haibin, who started to make films with his own personal savings and did everything by himself, which is the case for Along the Railway and Beautiful Men, his 2 first feature-length documentary films. Then for Stone Mountain, he was a director-producer. He had 2 more Chinese camera operators and 2 more Chinese editors. And then starting from Umbrella and 1428, is starting to work with the production company Cinex, Chinese production company. There is no big change for, camera, sound recording, but starting from since 1428, Mary Stephen, who is a Chinese editor based in Paris, started to work with Du Haibin, and she also edited A Young Patriot. So A Young Patriot is his first co-production with European and American partners. The crew is similar to Umbrella and 1428, but in addition includes 2 European sound designers. So we can see for Du Haibin that the change has came maybe not later than Wang Bing, but actually that his films do not engage as many investors as Wang Bing. So what has changed? I will not go into detail because I don't have time, but even if these 2 filmmakers have 2 different career paths, I would say we can still note some, similar features. So for the 2 filmmakers, they started with low budgets, their personal savings, and then for the last films had higher budgets. For the first films, so as I said, their personal savings were small investors, founders, and then co-production arrangements. They started with small crew, and then their crew expanded, they had better equipment. So when I say their crew expanded, actually they continued to shoot with small digital cameras and small Chinese teams, but the main difference is lies in that they now benefit from the expertise of European editors, sound and image designers. And their first films had technical imperfections, and then their last films have a better technical quality. Regarding film style, so they both continue to shoot their film in China. They continue to make films about themes and characters they are interested in. They record the lives of people from social margins who embody socio-economic changes and are witnesses to history. And their style remain close to direct cinema, observational modes, long takes, sequence shots, no voiceover. So here there is, however, a difference between Wang Bing and Du Haibin. So for Wang Bing, since his first film, he determines the narrative structure before and during film shooting, and then he seeks to implement his conception of cinematic time and space when working with a European editor and a Chinese assistant. Wang Bing is a bit different. We can note an evolution from photographic fragments without any clear storyline to washes organized around a plot structure. There is, for example, in A Young Patriot, a division into parts. So this evolution for Du Haibin clearly results from his collaboration with Mary Stephen, the editor, who edited 1428 and A Young Patriot according to the tastes of the American audience, because the producers, Cinex, has a partnership with Sundance, and also one of the founder of A Young Patriot was ITVS, an American TV broadcaster. So she said that she wanted to meet the tastes of the expectations of the American audience based on the producer's interests. So we see here that we have 2 different profiles. Wang Bing started to benefit from European funding early in his career because his cinematic style and the themes of his films appeal to the tastes of the European audiences. This is probably why he didn't have significantly to change his working methods. So Bitter Money is no exception. It had a wider distribution and public exposure than A Young Patriot. It was very well received by European and American cinephiles and critics who described the film as an art film about the negative effects of globalized capitalism and labor conditions. In comparison, Duhaibin only benefited from European funding for his last film, A Young Patriot. He didn't intentionally seek to change his working methods, but the film professional, especially the editor recommended by his production company, helped him improve the narrative structure of its film based on the tastes of American audiences. And this, interestingly, did not improve the reception of his film both in Europe and in America, because the topic was, according to film reviews, was not easily accessible for Western audiences. So it was about this young patriot who realized progressively that life was not as he expected it to be. And cinephiles and critics have described the film as one that doesn't reproduce the norms of art cinema because of its narrative structure too explicative, and whose meaning was only accessible to viewers having existing knowledge of Chinese society, and for others who did not have existing knowledge, they were unclear about the universal meaning that this single character could provide about Chinese society. So as a conclusion, I would say that in both cases, Wang Bing and Du Haibin view European producers and funding schemes as opportunities to develop their film projects without having to compromise their respective creative visions. They view the changes allowed by the co-production arrangements as improvements and not as an obstacle to their creation. So they say that this co-production allowed them to employ European professionals for editing and post-production. And before that, technical quality was not very good. And also in China, it was difficult to have access to good studios and good professionals in the early 2000s. And so they also say that the tremendous work accomplished by the producers allowed them to focus on the creative part of the filmmaking process and to benefit, as I said, for better technical and artistic device. So I argue, if we come back to the initial statements, that European funding schemes were a kind of soft power mechanism. I argue that co-production with European partners and European funding schemes are not only soft power mechanisms, they also can be considered as a space in which filmmakers can create new opportunities for cultural self-representation. For example, we can see with A Young Patriot that the film finally was not a theme and was not about a theme expected by the European audience. This implies that filmmakers can find in exotic, authentic rhetoric the possibility of being empowered by becoming active collaborators in the construction of their own images. Yeah, I quote Bergan, while updating representational regimes of otherness crystallized by a Western imagination. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Flora. That's great. We're right on time. So we're now moving online. Mike Thomas is going to talk about Ethiopian cinema.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Can you see me?
Yeah, that's perfect.
All right, I'll just share my screen.
Sure.
Okay. So thank you for having me. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here to share with you. It's really some reflections on my time as a postdoctoral research fellow on a project called African Screen Worlds, Decolonizing Film and Screen Studies, which is hosted at SOAS and funded by the European Research Council. My research focuses on Ethiopia. I've been researching Ethiopia since 2010. And I've got a book coming out in the autumn called Popular Ethiopian Cinema, Love and Other Genres. But so last time I was in, so this is just a picture of the northern region, the Gibraltar Mountains, and I'm a climber, so I use the old adage between a rock and a hard place to describe how I feel national or transnational definitions of cinema fit into the Ethiopian context, and I'll be reflecting on this and proposing this idea of screen worlds. So last time I was in Ethiopia was actually last year, between March and April. I was there to film a documentary as part of the outputs for the project, and I also curated a film week, which was a retrospective on Ethiopian cinema. So I'll be reflecting on this process, and all the photos from here on in will be of this trip. And just a bit of a setup for you of how the talk will proceed. So I don't really like to use notes, so I might go off on different tangents, but please bear with me and please jump in whenever you need to. Actually, I'll start the clock just so I have a bit of idea of time. So yeah, I'll start by just some loose definitions of transnational cinema and national cinema, and then propose this idea of screen worlds. I'll then go into the Ethiopian context in a bit more detail. I'm aware that Ethiopia has many images of it in different places. I'll go through the actual film context, and then I'll go through the film policy that was released in 2017, discussing these complex cultural flows and how I see the Ethiopian context being more productively explored through this term of screen worlds. Okay, so, well, a bit on Ethiopian cinema and Ethiopia. So here's the long-distance runner, Haile Gebrselassie, who I'm sure many of you have heard of. He was the marathon world record holder for a long time, and he himself owned a cinema in Ethiopia, and it was actually the first privately owned cinema that was opened in 2002. And this is just a conversation between him and Tewodros Teshome, who released the first commercially successful film, Amharic, locally produced film in Ethiopia in 2002 as well. Ethiopia, I'm not sure if people know, but is the second most populous country in Africa after Nigeria. It's just overtaken Egypt, and it has a long history, an ancient culture of independence, but also it's placed on the Horn of Africa, and it has specific relationships with Armenian populations, Greek populations, the Arabic world, and further afield. So I'll go into that a bit more as I speak. Okay, and so just for a bit of a semantic setup as well, and as we've already gone through yesterday with lots of the presenters like Marcos and Lucia and Chris, definitions of national cinema, which was popular, this debate of national cinema in the 1989 with Hickson and into the 1990s, which then got superseded a bit by transnational cinema. So, but I think both of these definitions are still really useful to how we understand films and cinema. So we have the Hickson quote, there are perhaps two methods conceptually of establishing or identifying the imaginary coherence, the specificity of a national cinema. First, there is the method of comparing and contrasting one cinema to another, thereby establishing varying degrees of otherness. Second, which is the method, or that is perhaps most common now and which I find most productive, is there's what we might be termed a more inward-looking process, exploring the cinema of a nation in relation to other already existing economies and cultures of the nation state. Then we have a transnational cinema definition, which I've used from an article that my boss, Lindy Wadovi, and Kate Taylor-Jones released in an introduction to an article editorial in Open Screens last year, which is the transnational is a far more manageable concept than national cinema, implicating, as it does, two or more contexts. It is a more pragmatic concept too, based on the understanding that in an era of globalization and the internet, people and institutions frequently work across national borders, and that most nations have less power to regulate today than they did in the past. At the same time, the term transnational incorporates the national recognizing the continued influence of the state as either an enabler or censor of filmmaking practices. But what I propose to help move forward these definitions, and what our team has been proposing is this idea of screen worlds. You can find a lot more of our research on screenworlds.org. But we believe in the need to bring African and other regional screen media contexts, so beyond cinema, and theorizing into comparative dialogue if we are to chart and describe these dramatic changes with greater accuracy and nuance. A multifocal, transnational and interdisciplinary perspective is required in order to establish the relationships between worlds, media, production and cultures. And worlds need to be studied to re-examine media theories as objects to be understood in their industrial creative genesis, their formal characteristics, and finally as spaces that emerge from the interaction of industry and fandom. So for us, this idea of fandom and spectatorship is also key in how we see, with the introduction of all of these new communication technologies, how the spectator or audiences have a lot more interaction with the products that they're consuming. So this interaction is also key for us as researchers to do collaborative work through example co-edited volumes, co-authorship, and opening up access, which is one of the biggest issues that we see across the world. And the inequalities are one of the most problematic things that we see. And in our commitment to grounded research in specific places of which we each have deep knowledge, we're keen to shift away from the use of the world as a rather meaningless, generic, homogenizing adjective, such as in world cinema, into a plural noun of worlds that acknowledges the differences between places, cultures, languages, and worldviews, and thus screen media practices themselves. We also agree with Francesco Cassetti that film as a medium seems to keep its identity in spite of fragmentation because of its high perceptive intensity or the high cognitive involvement it requires. This is paraphrased in Boni, but according to Cassetti, then, audiences are absolutely central to the sustenance of film as a medium through the intensity of their perceptive and cognitive engagement with screen story worlds. And this is why audiences are central to the concept too. So that just gives a bit of where we're coming from with this definition of screen worlds. And now I'll go into the Ethiopian context again. This is actually Cinema Ethiopia in the old downtown part of Addis Ababa. This was one of the days that we had a screening of a film released in 2005, which was a thriller of types. As you can see, there is a national concept around cinema and cinema production, but in Ethiopia, the popular cinema that has emerged since 2002 has been in the Amharic language, and there are over 80 different ethno-linguistic groups in Ethiopia. Amharic has emerged as the lingua franca of the country, but the country is divided into what they call ethnic federal states, each of which has their own working language. And around 50% of this population speak Amharic. So the film industry itself is very centered in the capital city, in Addis Ababa, and very much centered on these cinema theatrical releases, which allow it to be commercially viable. These films are actually pretty much the only films you can see in Addis Ababa. There are a few multiplexes which have Hollywood and foreign productions, but most of the cinemas are single-screen cinemas which only show Amharic films. There are roughly 100 films made per year which are released in the roughly 40 cinemas in Addis Ababa, and then there's also other cinemas spread out in other urban centers throughout the country. This is Ambassador Theatre, which is the biggest of those cinemas with 1,400 odd seats. This was actually the opening day of our little film week. which we showed two of the oldest films, Hiruta Batumanna, which is the red poster that you can see down the bottom. And I'll talk a bit about that now. Hiruta Batumanna, in terms of transnational and national, it was actually written and funded completely by Ethiopian sources, so written by Lala Ibsa, funded by what is now the the Commercial Bank of Ethiopia. But it was actually directed by Ethiopian-born Greek called Yakoris Lambros, and the film's post-production was carried out in Italy with the help of LICHAA. But the film was screened entirely, only in Ethiopia. The company that was set up by Lala Ibsa and Yakoris Lambros went bankrupt after the film was made. And so the Ethiopian Commercial Bank confiscated all of the copies of the film as collateral for the lack of repayment. So this film was only then given as a gift to the Ethiopian people a few years ago, which allowed us to screen it last year. The second film, Amharic or Ethiopian film that we can call, is called Guma, which was directed by the Moscow-trained, half Ethiopian, half Greek, Michel Papatakis, whose older brother is perhaps a bit more famous, called Nico Papatakis, and was quite a cad on the Paris scene, I think. But Guma was financed by foreign backers and had screenings in international film festivals such as the Cork International Film Festival in Ireland and the Moscow International Film Festival. So to certain degrees, these are all transnational, and they reflect Ethiopia's or Addis Ababa in particular's relationship with migrants coming from Greece at the end of the 1800s, and many of the cinemas at the time were run either by Greeks or Armenians and Indians who came and exhibited mainly films from India, Hollywood, Egypt, Italy, France, those kind of places. So these were a few of the films, Ethiopian films, that were actually released in Ethiopia. Then in 1986, with the communist Derg regime in place, there was an intense funding of film. They set up the Ethiopian Film Corporation in 1986, and they controlled all elements of production, distribution, and exhibition of film, apart from the printing of film stock, of negatives, which was carried out in London with the supervision of the Ethiopian directors present. The last film that the Ethiopian Film Corporation produced, they only actually produced 3 feature films, was Aster in 1992, a film that we're also lucky to show in the Film Week. And this is claimed to be a 100% Ethiopian film with cast, crew, post-production, funding, all coming from Ethiopia. This is apart from, of course, the printing of the negatives, which was done in London, but overseen by the director called Solomon Bekelewaye. In 1991, the communist regime was overthrown by the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, and they stopped all funding of film. And so in 1999, the Ethiopian Film Corporation was dissolved. So in the period between 1992, pretty much in 2002, there was a lack of government and national state funding of cinema or any screen content in Ethiopia. But we did see the influx of video, digital technologies in the country. So there were people making more entrepreneurial films, often funded by music stores and these kind of people, and became popular to to video weddings and stuff, and people use this technology to also make their own films. But there was no structure to screen these films, as all the cinemas in Ethiopia had a license which stipulated that all films had to be shown in 35mm film stock. But this all changed in 2002, and we saw Tewodros Teshoma, who produced, and he wrote, directed, produced Kazkaza Walafen, and it was screened in Alem Cinema, which we saw them speaking in earlier, owned by Haile Gebrselassie, and they managed to persuade the government to drop the licensing stipulation and allow them to show this digital video film that was very low budget, but also it was 100% made by Ethiopians, but there was funding from the Netherlands embassy in Addis Ababa, which was on board because the film tackles stereotypes concerning the spread of HIV/AIDS in Ethiopia. So after this film was released, there was a commercially viable way of making films in Ethiopia now that the cinemas had opened up to this video technology. And Kazkaza Walafen, a film about love, about modern Ethiopian ways of being and relationships, had made it popular to go to the cinema. Yewondoch Gudai was to follow in 2007, which became a trailblazer in the rom-com, or the Asking Yefikir film, which they say in Ethiopia. And this was a main draw of many people to go to the cinema, just to have a laugh, to go to the dark space on a date, and enjoy a couple of hours with relative anonymity from the rest of the world. I myself was one of these people who enjoyed a date and fell in love in the cinema in Addis Ababa. And in a couple of years, the building of cinemas expanded from, these are privately owned now, from 5 to 25 cinemas during this period. And this was when most of the screens were dedicated to Ethiopian films. Then in 2013, with this angle on transnational and national cinema, we had the first fully funded and produced Ethiopian film that was the first to be shown at FESPACO. I'm not sure if it was in competition or not, but it's the preeminent film festival in Africa. And Nishan went on to also tour various other African-focused festivals in Europe and America. And then in 2015, we have Lamb, which was the first Amharic language film to feature at Cannes. It was made by the New York University trained and American-based Yared Zaleka, who himself doesn't actually speak Amharic very fluently. And the film wasn't successful in Ethiopia, so it was more made for this European or film festival market. And a colleague of mine who was in charge of distributing the film in Ethiopia said that Ethiopian audiences would come out or leave the cinema early during this film and complain about its slow pace, and that it was more like a documentary and not so much like the fast-paced narratives and editing style and melodramatic nature of a lot of the low-budget films, genre films that they've become familiar with in the domestic cinemas in Addis Ababa. So here's a little collection of flyers that is in Cinema Ethiopia with some of the films, so you can see these kind of different styles you can see from like different genres of films. You have like the Fikr film, which are these more moody, love-centered films, and then you have the romantic comedy films that have brighter styles, laughing characters often that are engaging directly to screen. These are the two most popular genres in in Ethiopian cinema. And then you do also, because mainly they're quite easy and cheap to produce, quickly produced, but then you also do get more prestige films and other genres, such as the thrillers, and you also get this Yebetesab film, which is the family film, which often has child actors in it. Just check my time. Okay. So the Ethiopian film policy itself, transnational and national in scope, well, it was released in 2017, and this is just a few quotes from the policy itself. In 2018, there was a regime change in Ethiopia with Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed coming to power, and he actually he took away the censorship of films. So a lot of what had been said has already changed, and there was actually no source of finance for any of the of the policy suggestions. As you can see in the last box here, the necessary finance or implementation policy come from the following sources: government budgetary allocation, but there was no number, there was no figure, there was no time scale to any of this. Loans and donations, from who, from where, none of these answers, none of these questions were ever answered. There was no film trust or film fund that was established. So it was pretty much hot air that was released in 2017. This is another photo from the documentary that we've been shooting, and this is with three main filmmakers, and they themselves talk about this identity of what is Ethiopian cinema. And in this conversation, they themselves say, well, we can't rely on the government. The film policy is meant to be released in 2017, but we haven't seen any concrete results from this. So we ourselves have to be the ones who dictate where film goes and to identify what film and cinema means to us as Ethiopians. So Ethiopian screen worlds for me, in the Ethiopian context, is more a productive term than national or transnational cinema, because the main film sector is based in Addis Ababa, so it's a very much an urban city-based culture. It's commercially viable because of the theatrical releases in the cinemas of Addis Ababa and other urban centers. The main language used is Amharic, the lingua franca, that's spoken fluently by roughly 50% of the population. Other cultural linguistic groups do not have a structure to making filmmaking commercially viable, but still films in other languages are produced by dedicated cineasts who may also produce Amharic content. Ethiopian films now reach large Ethiopian diaspora populations in Europe and America, mainly through YouTube. The internet speed in Addis means that it is now possible to upload content straight to the web, and this wasn't possible 10 years ago, where you only had a dial-up connection. Now you got 4G, and people are just uploading content straight to the web, and TikTok and all of these things are also influential. Ethiopian screen worlds may also account for the influences of foreign screen content, which influences the Ethiopian cultures. For example, the popularity of Indian films, the influence of Kung Fu films, and the strong followings of television dramas from Japan, Korea, Turkey, Italy, or South America. And since 2006, the television market has expanded and licenses have been granted to many new TV stations, one of which has become the most popular is by dubbing foreign dramas or soaps or telenovelas into Amharic and then screening them on repeat. And far from being an isolated and inward-looking nation, as is often depicted of Ethiopia, interactions with the wider world and its particular historical trajectory has meant that Ethiopians have discovered worldviews grounded in a history of cultural exchange and interaction, reflected in and connected through Ethiopian screen worlds. I think that's all I've really got time for today, but thank you very much for listening. I'm Seganalo, and I wish I was with you to have a drink after, but anywho.
Thank you very much. And we're just on time, so that's perfect. We have about 10 minutes for questions. So I will give the floor to anyone online or here in our room to ask questions to any of our speakers. Yes, so we have a question here from Wafa.
Hi, thank you very much for three of you for this really interesting and great presentation. In fact, I have one question. I have one question for Flora and you, Electra, and for you, Michael. Flora and Electra, I was wondering, with this European influence and this technical aspect, don't you think that there is this technical aspect of the fact to work with European countries of France also have an influence on the choice of festival? Because I can see, for example, okay, it's Taiwan, it's not China or Greece, but Midisi, for example, worked with the editor of Jajanke, who is French, and I think some names are like important for festivals, so they can label the film and maybe choose them. I don't know, like sometimes when Ocean is supposedly the producer, suddenly like festival are like, okay, we want this film or something. This was my question for you. And Michael, I have a question about I wanted to know how long the film were released in Ethiopia. Like, is it very quick? Is it 1 week and then the film disappears and another one appears? Is it only on? Is it in theaters and then maybe in DVDs, or after that online or on some platform? I was curious about the kind of different steps in the film exploitation. Okay, so shall we first give the floor to Electra and Flora to answer the first question?
If you want, for the European co-production, I don't know. I think it's different. No, it's the producer who decides who has the relation with the festivals, not the technical things. But sometimes the producer has a relation with the studio. But in general, it's the producer, is not the, that's the problem. They consider it as very technical. It's not very important for them. It's only a question to turn a financial co-production, have the possibility to take the money for the country. But the producer, yes, if you want another answer, decide the festivals. And the world sales agent, which are made very important last 10 years, how they act with the festivals. They know people in Berlin or in Cannes or in Venice, and after that, the circuit starts.
Thank you, Wafa, for your question. I think, yes, the technical side is not really involved regarding exhibition issues. But it is true that the choice of the producer is important. But I would say for Wang Bing has already a name. So, I mean, all festivals already know him. So there is no big impact. For Du Haibin, conversely, he is not really well known. Although some of his previous films have been selected at international film festivals. But it was very difficult also to, I mean, his documentary could be screened thanks to the networks of the film producer and of the network of the editor. But himself, actually, yeah, it was very difficult to have connections. It's a difference with Wang Bing, who is very well known. And also it was kind of difficult because Wang Bing took the whole, I mean, for example, television in France, they didn't want to screen more than one, for example, Chinese documentary film in this period, and it was necessarily Wang Bing. So, well.
Yes, for Du Haibin, the name of Mary Stephens was like super important.
Yes,
for like to be labeled, like to be recognized, maybe by other festivals.
Yes, I think
Mathieu Laclos, for example.
Yes, the name of Mary Stephens, the editor, was very important, but yet it was not enough to get, for example, in France, a commercial release was very difficult to get. And they could get just in Brittany, in a small region in France, thanks to the network of the producer. But well.
Thank you. So maybe Mike, and then we will have a question from Chris Berry. I also want to say hi to Estrella, Sandra Fernandez, who obviously could join us. Thank you for being with us. So, Mike.
Thanks for your question, Wafa. Yeah, so distribution. So it used to be in the early days in 2002 that a film, if it was really popular, could be in the cinema for a couple of years. But obviously, since the expansion of filmmaking in Ethiopia, there's now roughly, say, 100 films produced a year. Popular films, maybe 3 weeks, but it depends on the popularity of the film. And it's the cinema owners themselves who will drop a film or who will extend the release. And then after the distribution, it used to be after distribution in the private cinemas. There's also 3 state-owned cinemas, the big ones, Cinema Ethiopia, Ambassador that you saw in the photos, and another one called Cinema Empire. So it used to be there was a second theatrical release because they had a different method of distribution. But since the last time I was back, they've also gone to the same distribution circuit as the private cinemas. And it used to be that films went to VCD often, or DVD, after their theatrical releases. But again, since I was last there, I didn't see any VCDs or DVDs being sold, and everything now just goes straight pretty much onto YouTube. Or there are also a few online video on demand websites, Habesha View, Sodere on demand, Fuchet. There's a few of them that also kind of invest in and have these pay-per-view services.
Thank you very much. Chris raised his hand. If you want to unmute yourself.
I have unmuted myself. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all the presenters. I'm aware it's coffee break time, but I do have questions for everybody. And for Flora and Electra, I wanted to ask, in both cases, if your research had also considered comparative cases of people, who did not go down the transnational co-production route, and how how they fared, whether that was a better, whether it had different kinds of outcomes for them. In other words, choosing, for example, in the Chinese case, to try to keep operating just within the Chinese framework, and not seeking funding from overseas, or trying to do all the production within Greece, and whether that is that better, or does it have other problems, other difficulties as a mode of production? And then for Mike, I was kind of interested to ask about this screen worlds concept. The example you gave us, it's from a much larger project that I'm aware of. And of course, the example you gave us was coming out of the Ethiopian case. So it was a kind of modified national cinema, if you like, model that tried to say, well, we have to think about the subnational, the regional or the dialect based, but we also have to think about international connections. But within the larger project you're working on, I was wondering, are there other people who are starting from frameworks that are not national frameworks? In other words, that they've conceived of a screen world that is a cross-border screen world from its origins. And I'm just asking that really to get a better sense of this idea of screen world. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Who wants to start? Flora or Electra?
Okay. Thanks, Chris, for this question. Yes, it's an interesting question. Actually, I think there is also the matter of time, because, for example, in the early 2000s, the main problem was technical quality in China, including editing. and it was a big problem for films who wanted to go abroad, have a commercial release, because the audience was not, the films are very long sometimes, and, it was difficult to understand for Western audiences, at least. So I would say that this problem probably is not as obvious as it used to be now, because I think we have very good now technicians, studios in China than it used to be in the early 2000s. But now, because the situation has changed politically speaking, I think that getting funding abroad is also a political option to continue to make independent films, because it has been more and more difficult in China. And also one of the shortage for filmmakers who did not choose to ask for foreign funding was distribution networks as well, as we said, probably with the producer or the distributor or the international seller. They would have their networks, and then it is more easy for the film to be exhibited. And probably one last thing quickly is, I think there is a good example that is Cho Jung-jeong, for those who know him. I followed him for the very beginning. He's an artist. He started to make documentary film by himself because he had already money selling his art pieces. But then I think that he started to get a name and be well known more in the international scene, since he started to work with international producers, for example, for his last film, A New Old Play, which has been co-produced with France and probably others, I don't remember. So yeah, I still think that there is a big difference.
Chris, in Greece, the infrastructure of sound and everything, it's implemented at the same time as in the Western Europe. It wasn't the problem of technical stuff at that time. This problem started during the Balkan transition, let's say, between 90s and 2010. The first Romanian film in Dolby Digital is in 2010 and made in Romania. But the problem I would like to point out is that we feel that the sound is technical. Otherwise, there's no problem to have a co-production with the film editor, for instance, because film editor is an artistic task, so they work together. The problem is that co-productions now put in the sound post-production the exchange of money, a financial co-production, and they would like to turn it in aesthetic. I told you, I give you an example which is very important. Angelopoulos, Theo Angelopoulos, which is a name. It was obliged to co-produce, it co-produced always with France, Italy, and Germany, because he had a very huge budget, of course. And of course, France, Italy, and Germany entered to this co-production. France, from the beginning, not from the beginning, at that period I mentioned, insist to give the sound post-production. What they have done, that I would like to make a research for other big directors, but maybe it's the same case. What they have done with a very, very good French, very well-known sound mixer, the French sound mixer came to Athens for all the films, but because the studio are the same, make a vacation, the film made by the mixer and the sound people, the Greek, and it was his name at the end titles for the production, for the co-production scheme. And I have these interviews by Theo Angelopoulos, by sound mixer, by his editor, he is a film editor, for all the films. And he signed all the time the final sound mix. I would like to investigate this for other big directors in other Balkan countries. I hope that I answered your question.
Thank you. Mike?
Yeah, thanks, Chris, for your question. Yeah, so on the project, there's, as you're aware, there's lots of different strands going on in screen world's ideas. And so Lindiwe Dovi, for example, she's focusing on African women filmmakers. There's other, so we're doing a volume, and there's contributors on the volume based on African screen worlds. Some people focusing on the reception of like Latin American telenovelas in I think in Cameroon. There's people focusing on music videos, so different media as well, and how they intersect with film industries in different contexts. So like, for example, African American music videos and how they use this kind of cross imagery. And for me, like genre is quite an interesting concept to bring about, and how different genres represented in different screen world contexts or screen contexts, and how they change or adapt different cultural specificities. But yeah, it's early days, and it's hopefully more like meant to be quite productive term that people can engage with to put their own views on it as well. So if anybody wants to engage with us, would love to discuss further. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I suggest that we take a 10-minute break and resume slightly before 11 Belgian time. And there will be a slight change in the program. Estrella Fernandez from SOAS will be the first speaker of the next panel. And the other speakers will speak in turn as scheduled. So we meet at, well, let's say 11. It's probably easier. Let's have a coffee, all of us. 11 Belgian time. Thank you. So we're back for the second and last panel of our conference on national and transnational cinema. Thanks for being with us. There's a slight change in the program. We will start with Estrella Fernandez, and Dominique Nasta will be the last speaker. So we'll start with Estrella. The floor is yours. We are sharing your screen and your PowerPoint.
Okay, thank you very much for this space. I'm actually at the moment in a Women Film Festival in Senegal, and that's the reason why I couldn't join you right now, other than the difficulties. I hope you can hear me well. And yes. I would like to present on women in Senegalese screen worlds, a concept that Mike was just talking about, and that I like to apply to the idea of Senegal because of various reasons. Because this takes into account the women that are working in the audiovisual sector, but also the kind of circulation that happens when filmmaking and screen media making takes place, because it's one that is involving the diaspora, but that it's very much placed here within the country and so on. So this is the beginning of a project on Herstories and practices. And I would like, next slide, please. And the reason why I'm looking at this is because I'm interested in looking at the place of women filmmakers in the Senegalese screen industry, and what does it mean to be a woman filmmaker in this sector, and what are the stories that are resulting from these women and these films that are being women-led as well. Next slide, please. So the aim is basically to do a bit of mapping to try and locate these Senegalese women that are based across the world, and to put them in conversations with other filmmakers who have established themselves here in Senegal. And at the end of the day, there is kind of like a broader aim of contributing to giving visibility to the work of women filmmakers, and examine the leading role of contemporary women filmmakers that are also situated within a long history of film culture here in Senegal, but yet what we know more is usually the men who have been working on cinema. And there's actually a reference to Les Hommes du Cinéma in a book that is the only book about Senegalese cinema entirely. And next slide, please. So I'll be talking a little bit about the research gap and the theories that have already emerged about women in the filmmaking industry, and then go through quickly through each of these points that I'm currently working on for a bigger project on this issue, which is basically mapping women filmmakers in from Senegal, then a brief account of the pioneers with a focus on Safify, the importance of entrepreneurship, rooted cosmopolitan filmmaking practices with an example as well, and the newer generation that has emerged from film training and cinephilia, as well as a reference to online television series and platforms where we can see this work, such as the Women Film Festival, where I'm currently talking from. Next slide, please. So if we look at the work that has been published on women in the international film industry, we will see that global film industries are very much a gender industry where women remain marginalized. And female directors have been facing many challenges resulted from a struggle that is not only to create, as it's evidence in most of the countries in the book cover, but also a struggle that has to do with circulation, with the distribution of this work, and therefore the importance to paying attention to the work of these filmmakers. Liddy observes that wherever you look, with some national variations, women remain underrepresented in the film industries as screen directors, producers, cinematographers, editors, and crew, and that they are less likely to be funded. And if they are, they would receive less funding. So this is an international phenomenon, really. In the book that I was just mentioning, published by Maged Diop, there is a really interesting classification of various generations of filmmakers, starting from the father of Senegalese cinema, who is Ousmane Sembène, the one that you see in the front cover. And in the very first generation, there are no women named. In the second one, we have the pioneering women filmmaker, who is Safi Faye. The third generation has no women, but then we see that the so-called generation from the year 2000 has so many names of different women who have been making films ever since the year 2000, and a lot of them are actually making the films at the very moment right now. So this is telling us that it's very timely to look at the work of Senegalese women filmmakers at the moment. These are some of the books that have been looking at the female gaze in Africa, and I want to highlight one of them, which is the book Women in African Cinema, which has already covered some of the work of Senegalese filmmakers, but I would like to build on this. In this book, Lisa Albichon and Stephanie van der Peer note that an ever-increasing number of women are using the audiovisual medium as a way to tell stories, reveal important issues, and express identities and subjectivities reflected on traditions, histories, and cultures. And there is also a really interesting book that I would like to put my work in conversation with, which is Sisters of the Screen, composed of different interviews made by Betty Ellerson. And I would like to highlight this book because it's a book that actually has been possible thanks to a methodology that I will talk about later, as you know, and understanding the researcher as a gleaner, as a person who really needs to be present on the field to know where these filmmakers are. And Betty Ellerson takes 1997 as a point of departure where 3 events happened where she was able to conduct a lot of the interviews that were made for the purpose of this book. Very interestingly, this first event is FESPACO, which is the biggest Pan-African festival in Senegal and in Africa, and one of the longest running. And it was a year in which Safi Faye was present over there, the pioneering women filmmaker from Senegal that I was just talking about. And that was followed up by an International Women's Day celebration, which showcased the work of many women. And at the same time this year, there was also an African Literature Association conference in Michigan State University that was entirely devoted to African cinema. And many of the work highlighted here was the work by women filmmakers. So this is just to say that the work that I'm currently conducting has some methodological implications where we really need to do guerrilla research and practice-based research, act as curators, as journalists, as people who are kind of gleaners trying to extract and collect little pieces of data in order to make sense of everything. And as we do so, there is a very important point on collaboration. So these are some of those places where I've been able to extract some of these pieces of information, and you will see that this is, for example, the festival that I'm currently in, the Women Film Festival, the magazine Our Tele, that is led by the curator Claire Diard, who is also involved in the Clermont-Ferrand International Short Film Festival in France, and the magazine Sensine, which devoted an issue to women filmmakers in Senegal in the year 2018. So if we try to map women filmmakers in from Senegal, this is currently what I'm doing, but there's some of them that are not really even present here. I've tried to organize them in years of birth. So as you can see, there are here loads of different names of women whose work is not sufficiently known at all. And many of the times when I've been working on this field of cinema in Senegal, many people who were asking me, where are these women, where are the women, and why don't you speak about women? And many of the times what happens is that people don't even know the names, if they belong to women or men. So I had in peer reviews to say, actually, this is a woman filmmaker and this and that. So that's when I thought that it may be a good idea to try and respond to this question that I'm often asked of where are the women in the Senegalese contemporary filmmaking scene? And this is, as you can see, the beginning of the project. And I would like to try and make sense of what unifies all these very diverse women and diverse experiences. So if we look at the work of pioneers, we really need to talk about Safify. And I remember that before even the book was published by Lisel Bischoff and Stephanie van der Peer, I used to teach about her work and say, I don't know why people don't call her the mother of African cinema, because if we consider Sembène the father, this should definitely be the mother. This is because her first film, Kadu by Kat, was one of the first films that was commercially distributed. And this is actually quite ironic, because then the work of Safify hasn't been very well known because of issues with distribution that are only reflective of the very big obstacle that many filmmakers here in the African continent face when it comes to trying and make the circulation of their films possible. Usually the distributors are based abroad, and this is starting to change as well. And I was actually yesterday talking to one of the young women in the filmmaking scene who is trying to put a distribution chain here based in Africa possible. So these are some of the works that she does. And what is really interesting is that women are always at the very center of the narrative. So if we go to the next slide, we will see here that Stephanie van der Peer and Lisel Bischoff agree that if Sembène is called the father of African cinema, Faye should really be known as the mother of African cinema. And what is really interesting about her films is that they are all about cultural, political, and economic issues set in rural Africa, combining elements of like fiction, non-fiction in ways that are very difficult to classify, but that I think are very defining of even the kinds of films that are made by women today. But that all these films place women at the very center of the narrative and focus on day-to-day realities of women's lives. Women alone, however, she argues, cannot live in Africa, and women can live in a community, and I cannot eliminate the community. This is just to highlight this quote that Safify never really considered herself a feminist or her work being feminist, and this has to do with the lack of inclusivity of the work feminism as understood by African women who don't feel that the discussions are intersectional enough. Here there is a very inclusive way of discussing about gender issues and a long tradition of neo-feminist representations also by men filmmakers. So this is one of the reasons why, for example, these festivals that we are in today is one where the work of men filmmakers is also highlighted. A lot of the women who are finding themselves in this sector are actually here through resilience, innovation, and leadership. In fact, the theme this year of the festival, Women Film Festival, Festival Film Femmes Afrique in Senegal, is leading women, leading creative women. And this is because many times those who haven't found a space for their films in the existing platforms have actually created their own platforms, their own enterprises and production companies. And two of these women are Fatou Kande Senghor and Angel Diabang, whose production companies are Waru Studio and Karninka, respectively. So I would like to talk about this briefly. Fatou Kande Senghor is a filmmaker who has made short films, who has made feature-length films all about women's issues, for example, giving birth, that has been circulating in festivals. But she's also the writer of the book Wala Bok about hip-hop, but where women plays a very important role, and she has recently adapted this to an online television series that we can see here on the right-hand side of the slide. So a lot of these women are not just focusing on one single thing or one single format. They explore many different formats, and they do this through entrepreneurship. Now, if we look at the example of Angel Diabang, she's also someone who has worked on different formats. She's also someone who has her own production company called Karoninka, led by women to deal with women's issues. And she started making documentary films such as Yande Kodu Lagriot de Senghor, or, for example, Kondo, Doctor to Save Women. But more recently, she's been doing short films that are exactly about women's issues that have to do with love, sexuality, polygamy, and so on. And recently, she's been the producer as well of an online television series, also available on France 24 television in France, France 24, that is directed by Moussa Sene Absa. When talking about women filmmakers that have been here for a while, we really need to talk about the work of Diana Guy. Diana Guy as an example of diasporic filmmaking, but also of what I like to call rooted cosmopolitan filmmaking practices that are very much informed by that link with Senegal. She's someone who was born in Paris, but has Senegalese heritage, and all her films have been always dealing with this issue of circulation, migration. And I've put here a couple of them on Transport en Commun. That is a road trip, really interesting, that allows us through music to know the personal stories of these characters. And what I wanted to highlight is that these filmmakers as well have been acting as curators or their own teachers, because many times they were lacking references on a screen or of where they could find women like them. And this has motivated Diana Gay to curate a program along with Valérie Ossouf entitled Tigritude, that is the first anthology of African cinema from 1956 to 2021, with 126 films from the last 66 years. In the newer generation, it's very important to pay attention to those spaces that have tried to change this dynamic of not finding African cinema anywhere in universities or spaces. And here we have to highlight the work of Cine Banlieue that was led by Abdelaziz Boy, and now currently as well the Centre Yenenga. These are two film training spaces that offer training for free to young filmmakers, where many of the women have been able to find a platform to learn about cinema from a practice-based perspective and make their own films. And this year in this festival, there is a roundtable that I have organized with one of the women, one of the first women to finish a film about women, who is Dianaba Ngom. I was with her last evening. And it's a film that is devoted to this founder of Senegalese, Abdelaziz Hoy, that you see on the picture over there, that has now passed away. And it's a film that is entirely about women's issues, talking, for example, about forced marriage, sexuality, children with speaking issues because of traumas, and so on. So yeah, this is also a very important aspect to pay attention to. The contemporary women filmmakers who are starting with short films, but that are dealing with very much women's issues. One of the most successful productions this year was not a film, but a television series distributed by Marodi Television that was called Mistress of a Married Man, Maîtresse d'un homme marié, and it was directed by Calista C., self-taught, born in 1989, very young women, as I said, that are in their 30s or even 20s making their films. The first season was like an absolute success at the moment. Even this is, how do you say, distributed by a television company in Côte d'Ivoire, subtitled into French, because not subtitled, dubbed into French, because the series is in Wolof and French. And it's one that created a revolution because women were talking about sexuality, polygamy from a very free perspective. And when I had an interview with the filmmaker about this series, she said that this was actually a series that was trying to respond to the lack of visibility to strong women on a screen. And she said the exact definition of Senegalese woman is a woman who does not exist, because when it is said that a woman is someone who doesn't say much, who doesn't look much, who does not walk making much noise, who should be a virgin until marriage, these are attributes of a non-existent person, because a person who lives must talk necessarily. She expresses herself, she looks around to discover the world, she goes wherever she wants to, and she's not subjected to opposing people. She has quite a strong relationship with her intimacy, with her sexuality, and she has the right to decide how she sees her sexual life, regardless of her religious beliefs. What has disturbed people, I think, is to listen to a person say that we women are free to decide about our sexuality. One of the platforms where we can see this work with a strong women on a screen is the Festival Film Femmes Afrique, where the main criteria for the selection of the film is that the films must be about a story of women's struggle, be it written by women or men alike, African or non-African, and that what is important is the message that the film disseminates. It is a festival that can be considered as an activist film festival because of the social issues on a screen that are resulting from this female gaze. And as such, is one that targets women's audiences, but also increasingly more young people, because according to the film director, the film festival director, they think that it is by raising awareness among these young people that we can start seeing changes in women's conditions in Senegal. So to conclude, despite the diversity of approaches and forms in these films, it is important to look at them together to try and understand and unpack this womanist and neo-feminist gaze in Senegalese women filmmaking practices. It is very important to pay attention to this, because the greater the number of women in key creative roles, the greater the likelihood of having more female characters, of having less sexualized representations, and of having stories about women's lives foregrounded. Women directors, as Melissa Thackway notes, use their own distinctive styles to posit an alternative female point of view, to focus on courageous, resistant women who either fight to survive in the face of adversity or more commonly refuse to accept the traditions that oppress them. And these are films that categorically denounce the structures and practices that oppress women, and they address a range of issues relating specifically to women in Francophone Africa, in this case, Senegal, for example, dealing with polygamy, prostitution, forced marriage, power relations between men and women, and female circumcision. But what is really interesting is that the majority of this film don't really show women as victims, but rather as survivors and resistors. Well, thank you so much for listening. I've listed over there some references, and I welcome later any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being with time. So we're now moving from Senegal to Tibet, or the diaspora, more specifically, and both, actually. Okay. So we have two speakers here, one who is online, Gokul, and one who is with us here in the room, Françoise. So I don't know how you want to organize. Let's see. Can you hear us, Gokul, and can you speak so we can check your mic?
Yeah, sure. I can hear you. I hope I am also audible there.
Great. Thank you. So I don't know who starts. Okay, Françoise, the floor is yours.
Okay. Hello, Gokul. Good morning. And hi, everyone. And thank you for organizing this panel and making room also for Tibetan cinema. So it's a we've never done that before, Gokul and I. So we've hardly, we know each other online, but we've met once, and now we try this difficult, maybe we'll see if it works. Gokul is in India. I'm in Brussels. Hopefully things will be fine. So to begin, I think I need to, jumping from Africa to Tibet, we need a little bit of explanation here. So Tibet was, I think, it's interesting that what happened the day before yesterday in Ukraine, we sort of reminds me of something. Tibet was incorporated in the People's Republic of China in the 1950s in the name of liberation. But only 3%, it's a small population, currently 6 million people living in Tibet, and 3% only of them live in the Tibetan population live in exile, mainly in Nepal and India. And they live under the authority of a government in exile, which is also called Central Tibetan Administration, CTA. We'll be maybe mentioning it a little bit later. It's based in northern India. So we have three maps here. On the left, Tibet as claimed by the Tibetan government in exile, and it's usually dubbed cultural Tibet because Tibet is not a country, has no borders, officially recognized. So it's about 1/4 of today's People's Republic of China. So I think we should be aware of that. Then you have what China considers Tibet, although China does not consider Tibet as an independent country, but moreover, they consider Tibet as only half of the size of what exiled Tibetans consider Tibet to be. So it is called the Tibet Autonomous Region in red in the middle map, and it's called political Tibet. And then we present a map here of how Tibetans are scattered all over India in different refugee camps or settlements, we should say. Now they have turned into, it's been a 60-year-long history, so they've become full-fledged villages and even small towns all over India and Nepal and Bhutan. And in purple, you have the headquarters of this Tibetan exile government. So also a little bit contextualization from the 1950s onwards till the 2000, Tibet-related films originated from China were made by state-approved and state-sponsored pan-Chinese filmmakers and lumped together under the category of minority nationality films, because Tibetans are considered to be a minority nationality in the People's Republic of China. So we give two examples. The most famous one, and we'll be referring to it again a bit later, is called Search No Move, 1963. It has really, it has shaped the idea that Chinese people have about Tibetans, and it's about a serf, a Tibetan serf oppressed by feudalism and who is liberated by the Chinese People's Liberation Army. And 1997, another film that also gained some popularity in China and maybe a little bit beyond, Red River Valley by Fang Xiaoning. Tibetans and Chinese fight hand in hand to repel a British invasion in Tibet in 1904. So these were for a long time the only Tibet representations on the people in the People's Republic of China on screen. But then this China-led Tibetan cinema or minority cinema was contested and complexified by two factors from the 1990s onwards, one in the PRC, one outside the PRC. So outside the People's Republic of China in 1990s, Tibetans from exile started making their own Tibetan films. So here's an example in 2005, Dreaming Hasa, Hase Milam. It was released in world festivals, reaped prizes. It's shot by the two major Tibetan, well, one major Tibetan filmmaker and his Indian wife, hailing both from India, Tenzin Sonam and Ritu Sarin. They've been having a 25, 30-year-long cinematographic career, and they are the best representatives at the moment, most famous representatives of exiled Tibetan cinema. And on the left, you have the Silent Holy Stones, same year, but first feature film made in Tibet by a Tibetan filmmaker in Tibetan language, the Silent Holy Stones, approved by the Chinese government. And so our talk will be in 4 parts. The first part, we see how these films, so we're talking about 15 films in Tibet, China, made by Tibetan filmmakers, and other films made in exile. So I'll be talking about the Tibetan films made in the People's Republic of China. So we have searched for this presentation how they were labeled in different venues. So if you look at, we have found sometimes they are referred to as coming from China, sometimes coming from Tibet, and then there's the hyphenization or the slashization or the bracketizations. You have China / Tibet, China bracket Tibet, Tibet hyphen China, China comma Tibet. So you see, it's a bit of a contested national labeling here. So I have given some examples. You can see maybe them on your screen. You can see there is a number of French examples taken from France for the good reason that first, I'm French. Second, these Tibetan films have a rather good reception in France, at least of the last 6 years. So many examples maybe will come from France, but not only from France. Yes. I just don't want to rush through, but I'm not sure about the time. So another interesting point is that one single film, one same film can be labeled differently. So Pema Tseten, who is the leader, the founding father of Tibetan cinema in the People's Republic of China, he made the Silent Holy Stones, released in France. It was made in 2019 and released in 2021 in France on commercial screens. His third film to be shown in France. And then you have, I'm sure we could find more, but from a small survey we made, we found that he had 3 different labels. His film was labeled as Chinese, in like for the French film distributor here. This French film distributor is Condor, for those of you who are familiar with the French distribution whatever landscape, and it's a medium-sized distributor, not very obscure minor, it's middle size, and he sticks to the official label as Chinese. And then you have the French Art Movie Hall in Toulouse, southern France, American Cosmograph, and they call it Tibetan here on their first page. And then you have, the festival, the French festival, Asian Cinema Festival, in Vesoul, which is the longest running Asian cinema festival in Europe. And it was shown last year or 2 years back. And it's interesting, the name of the film was Balloon, but then in brackets you had the Chinese films, although it has a Tibetan film, a Chinese name, although it has a Tibetan name. And it says China, Tibet. And then you have in Positive, which is a prominent film review journal in France, a monthly good, cinephile review, film review journal, and it qualifies it as Tibetan. So here again, we have this variety for one single film. So Gokul, it's yours.
Yeah, so when it comes to Tibetan cinema in exile, the situation is further complicated by many other aspects. Like, for example, if we look at a Tibetan cinema made in exile from the perspective of national cinema, for example, which is the major focus of this workshop, like Andrew Hickson, how he analyzed national cinema. Like, if we look at the Tibetan cinema made in exile from the framework of the economic terms, as in like where are the films made, or who made the film, who owns the film production, etc. From that perspective, if you look at the images that you are seeing on screen, which are like, screenshots from the Tibet Film Festival page, and Tibet Film Festival actually screens Tibetan cinema from Tibet as well as made in exile in Zurich and Dharamsala simultaneously every year. If you notice in the first image, Tibetan films made in exile are actually labeled in Andrew Hickson's way. If you look at it's labeled as country of production, like which country it produced, or collaboration, like funding, where it came from. In that sense, Tibetan films made by Tibetan directors, like or co-directed by Tibetan directors, we can see Germany, for example, in Pavo, or UK in case of Dreaming Lhasa, Switzerland is there. You can see different countries are given in the label. But at the same time, in the same film festival, if the film is made in Tibet, it's actually given Tibet. And of course, it's very obvious why Tibet Film Festival give that label to films. So in that sense, if you look at this part of the brochure of Tibet Film Festival, then if you look at from the idea of Hickson, then it's the priority is given to the themes. And at the same time, A Stranger in My Native Land is actually a film made by Tenzin Sonawala. He's a Tibetan filmmaker in exile, as mentioned by Professor Françoise. So he traveled to Tibet during that period of relaxation. He made a film there, but that film is given as Tibet. At the same time, same with the case of Leaving Fear Behind as well. So if we go to the next slide, there is another interesting dimension.
Yes, just a second. I cannot. I'm trying to move to the next slide, but it's stuck. Just a second, Gokul.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, in the next slide, in the first image, the same film festival, they actually show a film named One Way Home, which is directed by a non-Tibetan filmmaker, and it's given as Tibet, China. So it's the same film festival brochure, but these three are different. And at the same time, how Indian media reports here in India, which of course is home to the largest Tibetan community in exile, two films which were shown in the same Toronto Film Festival, one made by Pema Sadhanla in Tibet, Jinpa, and another one by Tenzin Sonawala in exile. One is shown as a film from India, and another is actually shown as a film from China. Though the mention of Tibet, like spotlight is put on Tibet, is there. And of course, in Chinese media, which already in English language media in China, there is like very few media actually report these films as Tibetan, like a Tibetan New Wave or like a Tibetan cinema. Usually it's referred to as the usual name, ethnic minority nationality films. And finally, if you go to internet, like a very common person, if you go to internet and search the word Tibetan cinema, you will see every Tibetan cinema. Because in the case of exile, the image and imagination of Tibet is largely determined by, 7 Years in Tibet or Kundum, which of course Professor Vanessa Frangville had already written about it. So 7 Years in Tibet, Pema Sadhanla's film, Pao is co-directed by a Tibetan filmmaker, Sonam Sedala in exile. Paths of Soul is directed by a Chinese filmmaker. So Tibetan cinema, that labeling itself is a very complicated thing. So now I want to.
Thank you, Gokul. So that leads us to maybe something which could be obvious to you all, but which didn't strike us until we prepared this paper, is that a national labeling for a film is never a given and can vary according to stakeholders. So we have how many stakeholders do we have? We have filmmakers themselves, distributors, festival organizers, cinema halls, film reviewers. So each can impose their own labeling or reading, depending in this specific case on their position towards Tibet or their interest and knowledge or lack thereof of the political situation. So there's a degree of subjectivity in labeling a film in national terms. But what we found anyway, that the common feature of all these presentations of films in any media is that beyond these mere descriptive data, like duration of the film, name of the actors, name of the filmmaker, etc., you still find everywhere the word Tibetan that features highly prominently in the titles and comments, and very few Tibetan films come simply as Chinese or Indian or Nepalese. So the Tibetan identity is always underlined at some point. So you may wonder, what about Tibetan filmmakers themselves? Because what do they want? What do they say in these very complicated situations? So I focus on the ones coming from the People's Republic of China. So they are in a very paradoxical position because in the PRC, Tibetan filmmakers in the PRC are deprived of an uncontested national labeling. They cannot say their film is Tibetan. But they insist upon being representing Tibet, or national. It is called national as Tibetan representation. So here we have selected a few quotes. So for instance, so this is Pema Tseten on the right in the New York Times interview in 2019. And the picture that accompanies the interview is interesting because Pema Tseten chose, I guess, or in conjunction with the article with a journalist, to be taken in picture in his home in Beijing, but under what? The iconic Potala Palace, which is the hallmark of what is Lhasa and Tibet, although he comes from 2,000 kilometers away from this, from the Lhasa. He's not proper from Lhasa, but he's from the extreme northeast of Tibet, part of in the PRC, but this is the picture that he chose. And then he said that he brought with him a desire to break the stereotypes of Tibetans encapsulated in Serfs, the 1963 film that I referred to, which shows the exploitation of a Tibetan Serf and his emancipation by the People's Liberation Army. So he wants to break free from these stereotypes. And then he goes on to, he says in another interview, when I was a child, there were many films about Tibet. I have seen many of these films, but these films about Tibet, while I was watching them, left me wanting for more. And I'm not the only one. Many of my friends feel the same way. These films were about Tibetan life, but the dialogues was in Chinese. Whether it was the clothes, the customs, the manners, every element, even the smallest, was inaccurate. Because of that, at that time, I thought that later on, if someone made films with even a little knowledge of the language of my people, the culture, the traditions of my people, it would be completely different. I remember thinking that I would like to make films later on. So this is why he decided to embark upon it. And then another interview which he gave to Positive, the French cinema journal, in October 2020. Before embarking upon cinema, that's the context, I thought we should restore a more authentic vision of Tibetan life and how Tibetans themselves perceive it. Another interview, my films are told from the perspective of my own people. And then another important filmmaker, Sun Tadya, who started by working with him and now makes his own films. He was interviewed in New York when he came over in 2016. Due to its Buddhist traditions, ethnicity, and rich legacy of art, the Tibetan culture is unique. However, it has never been shown through a Tibetan lens. There are a lot of materials produced on Tibet, but very little produced by Tibetans. There are very few Tibetan voices. I feel that people should and must use their own voices to tell their story. This is a must. Gokul?
And again, coming to Exile, even though the film which Professor Françoise showed yesterday, showed just before, Dreaming Lhasa, it was one of the very first films made in exile, Tibet, made by a Tibetan exile filmmaker. You know, in the earlier times, the exile filmmakers were also focusing on the politics of representational practices, identity construction and stuff. But over the years, when the life in exile evolved, their focus slightly changed. Of course, representation is at the fore, but at the same time, it changed to, you know, the everydayness of exile. You know, their films, their visual narratives started to look into or are grounded in how they negotiate this everydayness, which is an ongoing, constant process. For example, Sonam Sethala, who is one of the leading filmmakers, in a personal interview with me, told that, you know, it's a fundamental desire to express that actually started, you know, that's why he became a filmmaker. Then Tenzin Sawangla, who another famous filmmaker, he made a film called Dolma. He said to me in an interview that he was actually participating in a protest in Delhi against, of course, the Chinese state visit. At that time, whenever there was a news camera Of course, whenever this protest happened, police used to beat the Tibetans, which is unfortunately a reality here. And whenever there is a news camera or something, when the camera is there, the police don't beat them. At that moment, he understood that camera is very powerful. That was his entry point to Tibetan cinema. Similarly, for Tenzin Phuntsog, one of his films started with this famous sentence, "I was born in exile. I am a stateless person." And statelessness and cultural memory, which is transgenerational memory, is central to his work. And when it comes to Tenzin Desel, for her, the good Tibetan, the ideal Tibetan, the stereotypical template of Tibet, the spiritual Tibetan, she was actually contesting that through her film Royal Cafe. And for a very new generation Tibetan filmmaker, Kunsang Kiro, for her, it was affect. It was a memory, the place where she grew up in TSUCHIDA in Arunachal Pradesh. It was that particular fondness to that place where she born. That affect was the entry point for her into cinema. And finally, for Tenzin Shodhan, who recently made this amazing short film called The Quiet Solace of Sunset, for her, what stories are told and what stories are not told, like for what is in the invisible realm. For her, the film which she made, which was based on a coming out of a boy, a coming out story of a teenager boy, based on the homosexual theme, which is not often seen in Tibetan exile cinema. So for her, this gender or the masculinity crisis or what stories are told was the entry. So for Tibetan filmmakers in exile, even though at the beginning it was a representation, then it slowly changed to these aspects. Yeah.
So in fact, the Tibetan case makes us maybe, we have to contest possibly the label national, which is impossible, and transnational, which is complicated by the Tibetan situation. So if we just, we looked at what was written in the brochure in the conference, and we thought the definition that was given to us for transnationality was not proper, because I quote, "National cinema is a notion more frequently used to describe a body." Oh, sorry, that's transnational cinema. I think that's the wrong quote. "Transnational cinema is a notion more frequently used to describe body of films produced in countries and areas where the film culture either developed later than others or have been overshadowed by that of," no, sorry, it's national cinema, "of another nation state with which they share language and culture." So this is not possible. Yeah, sorry, we cannot talk about Tibetan national cinema because the PRC, the other nation state from which hails a number of Tibetan films, we cannot say that Tibetan filmmakers share language and culture with Chinese, with the Chinese. Sorry. Yeah, Gokul is yours.
And how the concept of transnational is discussed in the academic discourse on contemporary Tibetan cinema. I mean, we are, for the time limitation, we are focusing on 3 particular scholars, and I'm sure that more people, scholars have written about it. Kimberly Dukes, in her 2006 thesis on Tibetan cinema, she worked about Tibetan cinema in exile in its early stages. So she considers the cultural participation or the way Tibetans in exile, they make films or the oral narratives, everything as part of a media producer participated in by Tibetan exiles, including films and oral narratives, as part of what they called a transnational exile Tibet, which is actually beyond the nation state borders. So performance of cultural citizenship in the transnational exile Tibet through independent filmmaking, according to Dukes, is an attempt to establish a firm basis for identity as Tibetans, but at the same time, an attempt to gain control over the representation of Tibetan identity, history, nationality, etc., which is created whether by non-Tibetans or the Tibetan government in exile. So for Kimberly Dukes, the transnational aspect came as a, the cultural citizenship or the participation as a Tibetan exile. But coming to Dan Yu, again going back to the context of Tibetan cinema in Tibet, he considers a transnational in relation to the nature of production and the filmmaking process. For him, what he means as transnational is simultaneous interconnectedness of geographic locations, personal and professional mobility, or resources of different regions. For example, again going to an example, Professor Françoise was mentioning Pema Sedinla. So Dan Yu considers Pema Sedinla's mode of being, like the way he makes films, as in the films like Tarlo, Balloon, or Jimpa, the pre-production and post-production happens in Beijing, but the actual filming happens in Amdo, which is the eastern Tibetan region, which is his hometown, which he considers his homeland. And Daniel considers this mode of filmmaking as cross-regional. According to him, and also the reception of famous films in Europe, major international film festivals in Europe or South Asia, or mostly his films are watched in universities and film festivals. So he considers this technical or reception part as transnationality. And for another scholar, Mara Mehta, who predominantly focuses her work on Tibetan cinema in exile. For Mara Mehta, the word Tibetan cinema itself, what she calls, the word itself is claustrophobic. So she likes to call Tibetan cinema in exile as independent transnational cinema, a part of a larger cinema which is happening. So for her, for Mara Mehta, transnational cinema, because she said due to the fact that Tibetans live across cultures, they produce a syncretic hybrid language cinema in interstitial or liminal spaces. So that's why she considers it part of a transnational cinema because of this hybridity. And of course, it is informed by concept of Hamid Nafisi's accented cinema. And in her 2018 article, she says that she identifies nature of exiled Tibetan filmmaking practice as instance of complicated transnational diasporic accented cinema. So again, coming to the main focus of this conference, if we look at Higby and Lim's classification of 3 transnational approaches to transnational cinema, this comes in the 3rd category where, Hamid which is informed by Hamid Nafisi and Laura Mark's idea of, accented transnational diasporic post-colonial cinema, which in the concluding part, I will come back to.
I'm afraid we're running out of time. So in a way, what we want to say is that we contest, we cannot really say that Tibetan cinema is transnational because it is an imposed technical transnationality, working with Chinese, of course, working with French, Armenian, Iranian, but with a very strongly anchored felt desire to develop a core nationality representation. And second problem is that the transnationality often implies that the home and exile collaborate and films circulate. But in the Tibetan case, this is not made possible because of the Chinese state strict control over what Tibetans do in the People's Republic of China. So they are not allowed to collaborate with their brothers in exile. So I think that's the last slide. Okay.
Yeah, so yeah, extremely sorry. I will conclude quickly. So finally, what our major argument that we are putting forward is that, the transnational in general in film theory we discussed, it's actually always in relation to globalization, how the nation state shifted to the globalized aspect of film production. But in Tibetan cinema's context, globalization comes later. The first thing is that the specific historical and contemporary context in which Tibetan exiles or the Tibetans live in different geographical or physical locations. And for Tibetan exiles, nation, not just Tibetan exile, the Tibetan filmmakers in general, nation is actually central to their filmmaking process. So, for example, Tibetan filmmakers in exile always say that, Tibetan nation is always in making. So this concept of nation is central to Tibetan cinema, but at the same time, the film production happens in different parts of the world. So it is kind of in an in-between position. It's neither a national cinema nor a transnational cinema. It's actually a national in-betweenness, because both these things coexist in a strange combination. And of course, this is not this is actually beyond what Andrew Hickson considers as national transnational binary and stuff. So the 2 images, as you can see, is one from Sonam Sethulla's film Pema, where you can see it's a final scene where the characters are traveling in a bike. And when I asked filmmaker about this shot, he said that it's the in-betweenness. It's they are attaching this in-between state to geographical spaces, meanings, and in the next photo, even to a transitory space like a petrol pump. So the major argument that we are forwarding to summarize this presentation is that Tibetan cinema, be it in exile, what we call contemporary Tibetan cinema, the Tibetan films made with Tibetan filmmakers, is neither national or transnational. It's in the national in-betweenness, and it's a constant negotiation process. So that's all about it. Thank you so much for this space.
Thank you very much to both of you for this exciting paper. And we are now moving back online only with Professor TSUCHIDA from Waseda University.
Hi.
Can you say a few words so we can check your mic?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, that's perfect. So the floor is yours for 25 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone from Tokyo. I'm Tamaki Tsuchida from Waseda University. Thank you very much for inviting me to this workshop. Some of the presenters I have not seen for about 10 years, and I have enjoyed listening to all the presentations since yesterday. My PowerPoint, okay. Okay. So I have not been able to go outside of Japan for more than 2 years due to COVID, but I feel like I'm dreaming more and more about crossing borders because I'm stuck in one country and cannot move. In this case, in this sense, I think that the concept of national and transnational, which is the theme of the whole workshop, is impossible to distinguish, and it shows that nationality can only be defined by our external others. Well, I have been working for a long time as a programmer in film festivals, but I have also been working on film studies. I have been thinking about the Italian director Roberto Rossellini, and in particular about his late interest in the theme of cinema and didactic. Rossellini envisaged that the television is as the new medium, which was spreading across Europe in the 1950s, would play a role in educating people. He produced a number of television film series, including The Taking of Power by Louis XIV, Blaise Pascal, and Cartesius. Around 2006, when the centenary of Rossellini's birth was celebrated in Rome and Paris, it became known to scholars that Rossellini had conceived of an encyclopedia project on the theme of history through cinema. Unfortunately, however, his work is little known to the general public. He is still best known as the director of Neorealism or as the spiritual father of the Nouvelle Vague, with Ingrid Bergman in the starring role. By the way, what exactly were the now world-famous term neorealism? In André Bazin's What is Cinema, the final volume, volume 4, was subtitled Neorealism, an Aesthetic of Reality. We do not have enough time in this presentation to examine Bazin's thought, but we could at least say that he found in neorealism the possibility of a modernity in cinema. After the failure of the avant-garde movement in the 1920s, he sought a new way to connect cinema with the masses, and he found its final form in the emergence of post-war Italian cinema. Even in these 4 volumes,
recording in progress.
Okay, it's not clear how neorealism can be defined, and in them, directors such as Visconti, De Sica, and Blasetti are treated on an equal footing with Rossellini. Of course, as a Rossellinian, I would like to distinguish Rossellini from the other directors, but even if I put that aside, we cannot deny that his approach brings together films with different styles in a rather forced way. Let's go back to the origins of the term neorealism.
Very sorry, excuse me, Professor Tsuchida, your PowerPoint is not on full screen.
Okay.
Oh yeah, okay, and the slides, yeah, that's perfect now. Sorry for interrupting. Thank you.
No problem. Let's go back to the origins of the term neorealism. Neorealism, which blossomed in Italy after the Second World War, is not easy to define as an artistic movement, since there is no manifest like there is in surrealism. Moreover, the term implies a wide range of disciplines, not only cinema, but also literature, painting, and architecture. With reference to the Italian encyclopedia, the use of the term in Libre Alvaro's gente in Aspromonte. However, it was not until after the Second World War that the term neorealismo became popular, as in Elio Vittorini's Uomini e No, Carlo Levi's Cristo si è fermato a Eboli, and Italo Calvino's Il sentiero dei nidi di ragno, all of which dealt with the theme of anti-fascism and the resistance movement against Germany. In his book, Carlo Liziani, film critic and director, cites the following works as pioneers of neorealism in the field of cinema: Luchino Visconti, Ostensione, Alessandro Brasetti's Quattro passi fra le nuvole, and Vittorio De Sica's I bambini ci guardano. Indeed, these films focus on the distortions of Italian society during the fascist regime. And of course, Rossellini's Roma città aperta and Paisa are about the resistance movement against Germany. However, other major neorealist films, such as De Sica's Sciuscia and Ladri di Biciclette and Visconti's La Terra Trema, Episodio del Mare, dealt with post-war social issues such as war orphans, unemployment, and class inequality. So the thematic characteristic of neorealist cinema cannot be limited to anti-fascism and the resistance movement against Germany. It is true, however, that in these films, the social situation in Italy is portrayed directly. It should be noted that Liziani and other film critics such as Giuseppe De Santis and Michelangelo Antonioni, who gathered in the magazines Bianco e Nero and Cinema, participated in writing scripts for films of this period, and it is one of the characteristics of neorealist cinema. It is undeniable that these critics, with their strong leftist leaning, greatly contributed to the aspect of social participation in post-war Italian cinema. And certain films during the war, such as the bourgeois comedy called Telefono Bianco, were criticized for their escapism and for formalism. In Italy, many film magazines were born in 1930s, such as Cinema and Bianco e Nero, to discuss the ideal form of Italian cinema. In the article of this period, we can find the opinion that realism is the key to rescue Italian cinema. For example, people like Antonio Pietroangeli and Leo Longanesi use the expression cinema not artificial, or cinema without scenario, to describe the need to go out into the street and take the camera outside in order to get as close to reality as possible. Or, as Giuseppe De Santis puts it, the importance of shooting the Italian landscape. I think the reason why these young filmmakers, critics, wanted to uphold realism was a reaction against the Telefono Bianco trend in the commercial cinema that was the mainstream in the 30s. Luigi Fredi, a former journalist, was selected to head the film department of the fascist regime from 1934 to 39, and he visited Hollywood and introduced its studio system to Cinecittà, where many bourgeois comedies were made. However, the term realism, which was used to describe a departure from the convention for fiction films at the time, had no specific definition and was interpreted differently by different critics. For too long, neorealism has been described in terms of superficial features, non-professional actors, low cost, poor film stock, and location shooting. At the time, Italy had to keep production costs low because the domestic market was small and most of the film released were American. Low production costs meant avoiding stars and spectacle, and if they wanted to make use of location and shoot in ill-equipped studios, they had to use war-torn Italy as the setting for their stories. But we tend to think of these materials aspect as the essence of the phenomenon of neorealism, lured by the heroic image of the struggle against adversity that its filmmakers have promoted. It is said that the term neorealism in cinema was first used in 1943 by Mario Sendrei to describe Visconti's Ossessione, and by Umberto Barbaro to title an article he wrote for the magazine Film. They were all communists and believed that the future of cinema lay in left-wing humanism and literature. This tendency had spread by the mid-50s through the essay of Cesare Zavattini, and it became the basis to define neorealism in almost all textbooks. It is interesting to note, however, that neither Sendrei nor Barbaro used the term neorealism to denote the new Italian cinema, but instead used it to refer to the French films directed by Renoir, Carnet, and Duvivier. And as the film historian Tag Gallagher points out, after using the term in 1943, they did not use it again until the end of 1948. They did not use the term in reference to the films such as Roma città aperta, which are commonly referred to as neorealism, nor did they stress the importance of reality. In other words, neorealism as a cinematic concept only came to exist after the actual creative movement had passed away. In Martin Scorsese's filmography, My Voyage to Italy, a 6-hour documentary on post-war Italian cinema presented at the 1999 Venice International Film Festival, it celebrates the filmmakers of neorealism, such as Rossellini, De Sica, and Visconti, who had a strong influence on Scorsese. As a Sicilian-American immigrant in his youth and which forged his identity. But this seemed to be an Italianità, or idea of Italy, that he could only conceive of as a diaspora, looking at Italy from the outside. It is interesting to note a point made by Jean-Luc Godard in his film Histoire du cinéma, in the chapter entitled 3A, la monnaie de l'absolu, which is dedicated to the American film critics James Agee and the Italian screenwriter and director Gianni Amico. He examined the relationship between cinema and the Second World War. Sorry for the version without subtitle. So Italy did not fight hard, but suffered badly, and it even betrayed itself twice. So in the immediate post-war period, Godard said that Italy suffered from a lack of identity, but with Roma Città Aperta, its people recovered the right to look directly at themselves, and the amazingly productive period of the great Italian neorealism cinema arrived. Godard would go on to say, there were resistance films left and right here and there, but the only film in the true sense to resist America's occupation of cinema and the uniform way of making films was an Italian film. However, it seems strange that a group of films that symbolize the national identity emerged while it was lost. The French film critic Jean-Michel Frodon, in his book La Projection Nationale, Cinéma et Nation, suggests a mechanism by which film audiences can project an ideal image of themselves as a nation and thus acquire a national identity. According to him, Italy portrayed an image of self-desire through its films, which offered to itself and the world a conception of the nation that would be immune to the mechanism of bondage and political powers, showing that neorealism, like the resistance myth, was merely an histoire constructed in this process. Frodon gives the example of the popularity of Verdi in 19th century Italy. It was a cultural phenomenon in which the Italian people projected their national identity onto the abbreviation Verdi. At the concert of Verdi, the composer who embodied the spirit of Italian independence, there was the cry Viva Verdi, because the initials of Vittorio Emanuele Re d'Italia, the King of Italy who united the country, corresponded to Verdi. In other words, one of the ways in which a nation acquires a certain image or idea of itself, a representation, is by the projection of its desirable image onto a national figure, such as Verdi. And this process is the same as that of watching a film, the space of the cinema, where anonymous spectators, strangers to each other, face each other on a shining screen as if they belong to an imaginary community, is very similar to the space of a nation, where complete strangers embrace an imagined community of the nation in their own minds. It is only through the construction of the phenomena of neorealism that the Italian nation acquired an identity of Italianità, rather than through the films of neorealism, where the characteristics of the Italian nation are depicted. From this point of view, neorealism, as we generally perceive it, seems to be more of a myth, and in that regard, it is very similar to the Italian resistance movement. In the modern history of Italy, the organized military movement of the resistance lasted a short and limited period of about 18 months and was almost exclusively confined to central and northern Italy, but it is believed to have liberated by itself Turin, Milan, and other major cities from fascism on its own before the arrival of the Allied forces. This myth of resistance is a spiritual pillar that post-war Italy has sought to build upon, and the emergence of neorealist films as the collective mentality of the nation has coincided with it. In other words, the spiritually lost nation needed an expression that defined itself. Italo Calvino, who had joined the partisan with his brother during the fascist regime and worked in the Alps, wrote in the preface to the second edition of Il Sentiero de Mediterraneo, The Spider's Web Path, written in 1947. If I say that in those days we made literature out of our condition of poverty, I'm not really talking about some ideological program, but rather about something far more profound that was inside all of us, the spirit which animated our attempts to establish a new tradition of fiction, which had to be built entirely from scratch. So thank you very much for listening. It's the reference. Okay.
Thank you very much. We are now moving to our last speaker, Dominique Nasta. We're sharing the PowerPoint. And the floor is yours, Dominique.
Thank you, Vanessa, and thank you for co-opting our film department for this wonderful initiative, which is definitely a different approach. So mine is a more aesthetic narrative-based one. So at the beginning of the 21st century, Romania, an East European country from which isolated auteurs had previously made their way outside the quite diversified domestic circuit, somehow unexpectedly produced one of the few coherent new waves in the context of world cinema, having garnered important international recognition during the last 10 years. Its main representatives were born and raised during the same period dominated by Ceausescu's communist reign, 65-89. Their films, most of which have become familiar to art cinema specialists and have fueled an important amount of recent exegesis, reflect in highly original ways the 21st century zeitgeist of a country which has always had a very complex positioning inside the European socio-political cultural sphere. Contemporary Romanian auteurs brought forth a set of questions without necessarily aiming to answer them. These questions were both related to a new way of confronting historical or ideological facts and moral dilemmas, and to a rhetorical reshaping of the grammar of cinema. My main argument is that there are three essential features quite often at work simultaneously: the concern with politics and ideology, the use of verbal and visual irony, and the reflexive audiovisual strategies, which constitute the backbone of this outburst of ongoing creativity. Contrary to recent hypotheses about Romanian cinema having turned transnational, I argue that it is its highly national specificity, situated at the crossroads between Latin and Balkan socio-historic representations, which explains its unprecedented complexity in the context of Romanian cinema. We find in Romanian contemporary cinema a term Jan Polski has labeled as structural isomorphism between the framing text and the secondary text, in films which features both highly realist political hints at the visual fabric of pre- and post-communist society and digressions brought by the ironic voice. As such, irony indicates the existence of a narrational voice and disrupts the construction of a closed fictional world which could yield an impression of reality. What appears to be the case on the first surface differs radically from the truth. I have used Paul Ricoeur's diamond narrative pattern of threefold mimesis he takes up from Aristotle because it's very simple, it's very clear cut, and it will help us with the examples we're going to study in terms of national and European identity. So Ricoeur works a lot on this tripartition mimétique, threefold mimesis, and he confronts historical time to narrative time and to refiguration, which is the reception of work with the audience. And I have also quite often used and found very useful the R.B. Warburg concept of sufficient realm. So actually what is the intermediate space, which applies very much to the aesthetics of Romanian cinema. Actually the art cinema represented by directors sharing a generational genome did not emerge from nowhere. As developed in earlier contributions, the new directors have benefited from the essential contribution of Lucian Pintilie, whose career spanned for nearly half a century, starting in the late 60s and continued into the 21st century, and helping to establish the groundbreaking thematic and aesthetics basis. Mise-en abîme and irony appear as a corollary as early as Pintilie's reenactment, which most new wave Romanian directors refer to. The mirror of totalitarian conformism is broken, and the plot centers around an act of juvenile delinquency meant to be reenacted and serve as an example. Napster's humor turns a ridiculous totalitarian enterprise into a huge mise-en-abîme of a deranged authority. So here's a very short clip from the film's spectacularly opening credits. Actually, it's a flash forward where the main character, who will die tragically at the end, keeps asking, "Why did you hit me?" I'm sorry, some of them have French titles or not titles at all, so I will translate when it's necessary.
Gata! Așa, mâna. Cine ridici încet capul, drumul la sânge. Capul spre noi, așa, capul spre noi. Așa. De ce ai dat, mă? Întoarce capul la probă. De ce ai dat, mă? De ce ai dat? Stop! Bună! Atențiune, motor!
Over and over again.
Mira complet. De ce ai dat, mă? De ce ai dat? Stop! 254 A4! Gata, gaz! Așa, strânge mâna, să se ridici încet. Și caz aloc, așa, încă o dată. Nu tremura prea mult, așa, du drumul la strânge. Mirați complet. De ce ai dat, mă? De ce ai dat? Stop! Dați-mi picioare în apă. 54 A5! Gaz!
Intimations of reflexive narratives and aesthetic choices, which Thomas Elsässer calls marked diegetic spaces, are to be found in some Romanian films of the 80s. They are thus his work in Mircea Danieluk's outstandingly modern Cine Verite vehicle shot on location at the Bucharest main railway station, microphone test, prova de microfon. The opening credits unroll while an off-screen female voice recounts how she had been insulted, aggressed, almost raped by an unknown individual she had met on the train. Danieluk overtly quotes Claude Lelouch at a certain moment in the film, and he also plays the part of the cameraman journalist, seeing and watching TV and referring to a Lelouch-like scenes of dogs running on the beach in one of the sequences. And so again, just a few moments. There is no translation whatsoever, so it's just the tale of aggression of the young girl on the train.
Atunci spuneți-mi altceva, mie.
The journalist asks him what he
Nu vă
wants.
uitați la mine, să vedeți măcar cum arăt. Poate că
Have the
sunt,
framing
poate că
of
merită.
the television screen.
Eu până la început, așa, cum s-a întâmplat, nu? M-a luat cu mașina și m-a dus mai multe județe. În Bacău, Piatra Neamț, mai multe județe ale țării. Și după aia m-a oprit în București și m-a lăsat acolo. Pe data de 2, mi-a ieșit un băiat și el m-a dus cu tramvaiul 2 stații, după aceea m-a coborât jos și m-a dus la cofetărie, ne-a dat un suc și după aia m-a dus acasă la el și m-a forțat și a bătut joc de mine și după aia m-a bătut. Părinții lui au făcut gălăgie și m-a bătut și eu am vrut să plec. Am vrut să plec, am zis că eu plec de unde am venit, din Iași, de unde am venit. Și i-am spus ca să vii înaintea mea la gară și n-a venit.
Cine să vină?
Ea.
Care e ea? Sora?
Sora lui tata meu. Și n-a venit. Și eu...
Interestingly enough, after the fall of communism and before the generalization of the Romanian minimalist trend represented by the aforementioned auteurs, irony was used as the main vehicle for dismantling European stereotypes. In Asphalt Tango, director Nae Caranfil presented post-communist Romanian realities in a highly cynical, sarcastic, disenchanted way. If the setup of this road movie looks conventional, revisiting the myth of young girls dreaming of a perfect marriage with the ideal French husband, in terms of manner and style, it proves an original and dynamic as the early films of Miloš Forman. The narrative premise sets forth a sly French theatrical agent who strikes a deal with her Romanian male counterpart and charges him to find young and attractive Romanian girls ready to board a bus for Paris and act as prostitutes under the lucrative cover of cabaret dancers. The traveling girls want to forget everything about their homeland and language and find their fortune in a better place.
Dar ce are, rămâne și ea cu amintire, dacă tot pleacă la Paris.
Noroc, sănătate. Doamne
Tot ce-ți
ajută.
dorești, mamă.
Așa deci, zici că o să-ți fie mai bine printre străini?
Oui, je crois que je serai mieux.
Ce este? Trecem pe limbi străine mai nou.
Dar ce faci, puiule? Vorbești cu noi pe franțuzește?
Paranteză. Am luat o decizie. Începând de azi, ora 0, nu mai vorbesc română. O consider limbă moartă. Și am să fac tot posibilul să o uit. Cam astea sunt ultimele mele cuvinte românește. J'ai fermé la parenthèse.
3 films directed in the first decade of the third millennium about the Romanian Revolution, released concomitantly in 2006, contained very interesting cases of mise en abîme and use irony to counteract the chaotic and manipulative aspect of the revolutionary event and provide it with an international appeal. The way the national revolution was presented worldwide via television channels and the controversy surrounding the revolution. The first one, Cătălin Mitulescu, How I Spent the End of the World, echoes Emil Kusturica's entertaining post-communist chronicles. And sticking to a classical cinema standards, a transparent narration with multiple storylines converges at the end via a satisfactory payoff. The film's first payoff is an interesting case of an embedded mise en abîme. Through dynamic cross-cutting, a group of young boys relish at the main characters explicitly targeting the dictator with his catapult. When the image starts to tremble because revolution is on the move, an old neighbor is persuaded there is something wrong with the set, nervously banging his fist over it. So you have some photos, some captions here where you can see the mixture between the television, the fictional time, the real time, and historical time. So this is very respondent to Ricoeur's triple mimesis theory. Radu Muntean's The Paper Will Be Blue, shot actually the same year, is far more radical style-wise and focuses on the itinerary of a military conscript tragically caught up in the events of 1989. Once inside the Romanian mythical TV station, a challenging embedded reflexive paradigm is unleashed. While the militia unit researches the conscript, the Salvation Front is taking position as figured on the television screen. You can see them on inside the small television screen. And the soldiers arrive to report that the dictator's car on the run has been spotted. So actually everything inside the same scene. The mise en abîme obviously reveals Romanian history on the make, enhanced by reflexivity and by highly ironic dialogues.
E foarte rău că nu se respectă disciplina, mai ales la militari, că altfel se ajunge la haos și la dezordine. Dar ce să-i facem? Știi cum e vorba? Miliția nu e armata.
Ascultați, s-a venit un telefon. Ceaușești au fost văzuți într-o Dacie galbenă de Ilfov cu numărul 2B, 2ILE 1918, în dreptul localității Giurgeni.
Dar ile ăsta nu e Ialomița? 2B cât?
2ILE Ialomița, da. 2ILE 1918.
Auziți? Ia stați așa. 1918 pe ăsta în anul lui?
Extraordinar.
Actually, real time and have television time with the broadcasting of the revolution going on, and you have the soldiers coming and saying that Ceausescu's car has been spotted. So you can see that the narrative and the aesthetics and the embedding all go in the same direction. Corneliu Porumboiu's hilarious comedy, of course, everybody's familiar with, which broadcasts a TV show where they have to decide whether or not there has been a revolution in an insignificant province, operates with reflexive irony and with subtractive principles. So now you can see the real minimalist dialectics of the new Romanian cinema. So the studio looks very improvised. The town hall poster in the background will fall. One of the participants provokes laughter because he wants to enter the frame. The cameraman is trying to frame and fails to do so. So you have a structural isomorphism, a relationship of equivalence, and a very witty dialogue, tableau-like visuals, and that then kind humor. Maybe just a few seconds, everybody knows the film, but it's interesting in the context of the general theory of mise-en-abîme.
E foarte rău că nu se respectă disciplina.
Le contenu n'est pas disponible. Le terme n'est pas disponible.
Okay, everybody knows this film, of course. We can go. Almost 10 years later, Porumboiu's The Treasure offers a wonderfully ironic reframing of the fairy tale intertext. The young father is reading the Robin Hood story to his son. He's tempted by a neighbor who asks him to help excavate a buried treasure, actually money from communist times, from his garden. And the parents' love thus transforms life into a fairy tale variant of the Western Robin Hood myth. Communism's shadow looms in the distance, but the relationship between the father and the son and the story of Robin Hood help the audience worldwide to understand the tension that underlies the character and the way he relates to this world. An internationally acclaimed found footage author, Andrei Mujica, watches 1,000 hours of footage on Ceausescu and conceives his own autobiography of Nicolae Ceausescu, a montage film made to an ironic extent in the dictator spirit, offering a version of history that also features public appearances without any voiceover. The autobiography is a 3-hour case of intertexts edited from pre-existing most offer propagandistic footage. The history of Romania and the implicity of the whole world is presented in an exciting fiction. Watching a ludicrous show containing a patriotic ode sung in Romanian by a Korean singer and applauded by both dictators during Ceausescu's official visit to Korea, we quickly understand this is a perfectly orchestrated mise-en-abîme. Hopefully this will work. Et pourquoi vous n'avez pas fait le test avant? Vous avez fait le test? Il n'y a pas quick time.
Ben, à mon avis, c'est plutôt...
C'est comme si les fichiers n'avaient pas été uploadés.
Sorry, everybody, we have a technical issue with some videos.
On peut télécharger peut-être sur l'ordinateur.
Parce que celui-là, il est très important, je voudrais...
Moi, j'ai vraiment ça.
que vous avez fait des tests.
J'imagine qu'ils ont testé en laissant la première vidéo, simplement.
Parce que celui-là, je tiens à
je comprends qu'il n'ait pas regardé toutes les vidéos. Ils ont regardé une ou deux.
Et si on met le mien, ça va pas? Si on met l'ordinateur?
Ben, il faudra tout débrancher. Je sais pas.
Oui, ça, en japonais.
Japanese. Là, je vais avoir du mal à vous aider aussi si c'est en japonais.
Parce que chez moi, ça marchait parfaitement. On m'a dit que vous aviez essayé ici. Si j'avais su à la pause, je l'aurais rechargé.
Je pense qu'il faut mettre switch to being English en haut à droite.
Mais en fait, Bing, c'est juste une idée.
Déjà.
Sorry, everyone, we may have to upload the software so that we can read the videos.
Vous voulez, mais je pense que c'est pas une bonne idée. Parce que
Maybe we can move on to the next slides and then come back to this video.
Okay, but maybe all the slides have the same problem because I thought there was a test done, so I cannot know which slides don't have it. So it's very difficult for me because the whole text is related to this, so I don't know how to handle this.
How about the next slides? Are they related to the same video?
Yes, there are some of them don't have video, so I can. Okay. Okay, so from all the possible models of political modernism, Radu Jude takes his explicit reference to the Godardian one. I do not care if we go down in history as barbarians, begins with a shot of the screen within the screen, on which unfolds a fragment from a Romanian World War II anti-Soviet documentary about the liberation of Odessa by the Romanian extremist right-wing army led by Field Marshal Antonescu. It is the first in a series of texts, some of them audiovisual, that Jude's film presents to us, framing them precisely as texts. The Brechtian device consistently shown in the film create the feeling of a history lesson containing terrible evidence of Jewish mass murder during World War II, destined both to Romanians whose history was dissimulated for almost half a century and to Western audiences with no information whatsoever about these series of events in Romanian history. Similarly, Jude's most recently completed feature, which got the Golden Bear in Berlin, Bad Lucking, Banging and Loony Porn. This title echoes clearly a woman in her 30s who teaches history and finds herself in the middle of a terminating scandal when a video of her having sex with her husband leaks on the internet. And the second section of the film, in which the stories, the woman's story is left on hold, is totally non-narrative and lasting 25 minutes. This section presents itself as an alphabetical list of terms, as you see the terms inside the frames, each with its own definition, which can take the form of an aphorism, a quote, a gag-like, a haiku-like juxtaposition of image and text, a YouTube video, or a very short review-like sketch. The list begins with the date of 23rd August, meaning the date when Romania switched sides, and includes names of persons, institutions, and buildings which function as Romanian brands at home or abroad. Ceausescu, the Romanian Orthodox Church, the House of the People. These definitions are somewhat playful, somewhat dry, sarcastic, sometimes brutal, resembling a mock tourist guide for foreigners. Il y a une solution, je peux continuer. Can we test and see?
Une minute, oui, mais c'est 40 mégas, ça devrait prendre une seconde, quoi.
Donc, c'est doing. Okay. Okay. Hopefully, I want to show you the most wonderful clip of the whole talk, but it's not possible. So we go on. Okay, so Christian Monju chronicles in his seminal 4 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days in an extremely accurate way the anti-abortion terror of everyday life during the last days of communist dictatorship. Monju clearly opts for a reflexive paratextual title which relates directly to a line uttered by one of the heroines in the film. Notwithstanding the important amount of exegesis dedicated to this film, with the aborted fetus. The later is clearly a mise en abîme of the entire ideological enterprise it is meant to denounce, namely Ceausescu's demographic policy, which had long-term devastating effects on Romanian society. A case of politically relevant mise en abîme occurs on the way to the hotel when the abortion has to take place. The abortionist asks Otilia, the main characters, to wait for him in the car as he needs to talk to his mother. What we understand from their exchange is that a friend has been queuing for the mother to get some sugar at the supermarket. It is clearly meant to circumscribe communism's end of reign, profound economic crisis into the bigger issues of illegal abortion. Composition in depth and the embedded dialogue with foregrounded sound leads to an ironic heterodiegetic mise en abîme. As in Tintoretto's 18th century painting Susanna and the Elders, we are invited to look and share overhearing with Otilia from a distant static point of view. This is why I related both frames. Monju's Beyond the Hills proves another very original rendering of a politically connoted society issue in aesthetic terms. At stake is a case of exorcism from a Romanian monastery where a young orphan girl died in mysterious circumstances in 2005. Embracing democracy after the fall of communism, Romanians claim they suffered because the leadership suppressed religion and destroyed numerous churches and monasteries. Monju's staging of character interaction inside the monastic world of the film is a rematch of the iconic template. The characters occupy the cinematic frame in the position somehow dictated by the orthodox icon's composition. He thus brings in a new type of reflexive metatext, alternating handheld takes with fixed shots staged in depth so as to highlight the dynamics of dogmatism and eroticism. Let me see if it works. Okay, this one. Okay, so the last example is from major director Cristi Puiu, whose oxymoric title, because it's called Aurora, but actually it's the morning after a crime he perpetrates. And he's he's actually making the deposition at the police station. And it's about a self-acknowledged series of murders. So he plays himself as Danieluk in microphone tests. He's acting, he's the actor and the director of his own film. And he comes and makes this deposition at the police because it's really his despair against the ongoing post-communist society. And so we have a very, very interesting contrastive occurrence between the deposition where, I'm sorry, still French subtitles, but it's just he's arriving at the police and giving the deposition. And then the closing credits and a contrastive piece of music, which is a Louis Moreau Gottschalk, a pre-existing quote from some classical music heard during the closing credits. Maybe. Okay.
nume domiciliat în București, născut la data de... Și așa mai departe. Povestește acolo frumos și cu detalii cum s-a întâmplat toată treaba. Dacă nu-ți ajung foile, îți mai dau.
You can make a deposition and tell everything. Tell the facts. So why did you murder all those persons? And please explain why you murdered those persons. And here you can write your deposition.
Un pix cu steaua. Eu mă duc până la Buddha.
Make the explanation after and try to see if we manage. Yes.
But it has to install the program first.
The trends going around if we can show the video, but that seems a little bit complicated.
Alors, je peux proposer ce que j'ai dit juste avant, c'est que moi je partage à partir de mon ordinateur. Si vous ouvrez votre ordinateur, ça va être beaucoup plus compliqué. Je suis désolé, mais voilà.
Et on peut faire à partir des autres.
Oui, on va. Mais ça signifie que sur YouTube, il faut s'excuser aux gens sur YouTube parce que eux, ils ne le verront pas. Que ça a l'air d'être une simple réunion Zoom, mais c'est quelque chose de beaucoup plus compliqué que ça. Et donc,
pour YouTube,
c'est combien de vidéos qui ne marchent pas? Combien de vidéos?
Non, une seule avec toi, c'est pour la Corée, qui est la plus importante.
Nous, là aussi, c'est pas ça le problème.
Okay. For YouTube viewers, we have to apologize because you might not be able to see the video that we want to show next.
I hope it works because I can't even monitor if it's going to work or not because I'm supposed to be monitoring and not playing.
This will be available for Zoom viewers only. Sorry about that. Technical issues happen all the time with hybrid meetings.
Actually, it's the most important clip of the whole talk.
It's always with the most important videos that things don't work.
So
not this one, the following one.
I'm just checking if it works.
Yes.
It works. And can you hear that? Because I can't check if you can hear it. So.
No, I cannot hear.
No, it's normal. You don't hear it there, but I don't know if the other people can hear it. You maybe ask.
So can people on Zoom hear the sound of the video?
I'm afraid not.
Yes.
No.
Okay, thank you.
Who said yes?
Who said yes?
I was listening. Now I don't.
Okay.
It's not hearing.
Partout ce matin.
Should be better.
Bună ziua, dragi telespectatori.
Can people on Zoom hear the video?
Yeah, they can. Okay, so now let's now it's not working. No. Your screen sharing is paused.
În istoria României.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so now I have to go to the next slide. How can I do that?
Next slide are captions, so the one after the next. Two slides further. Donc c'est celui-ci, puis un autre, et puis voilà, ici. Okay, thank you very much. I would like to come again to the text because now you're closer to the clip. So the idea is that this is totally ludicrous because the singer doesn't know a word of Romanian, so she has learned everything by heart. And Ujica has looked for the excerpts in terms of found footage that corresponded in terms of editing to the reaction of the dictator with the song. And so we understand it's a mise en abîme because it's something he reconstituted in terms of found footage and of montage. So as a conclusion, I would like to say that Romanian cinema clearly stands as a national one, while combining European influences with highly specific modes of expression. And it's a quite unique case in contemporary context. We can see it from Jude's last example I showed you, because it's very consistent. So the same techniques, the same type of self-reflexivity, the same type of mise en abîme is to be found. It started in the early 60s with the seminal figure of Pintilie, and it's still going on presently. So thank you very much, and really sorry for all.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for your talks, and so sorry again for the technical issues that we have to face. So we're slightly behind schedule, but we'll take the time that we need to receive questions either from Zoom or from the room. I think I saw a hand. Yeah, so Chris, Barry, you raised your hands.
Thank you, Vanessa, and thank you to all the speakers for your papers. I just had a question for Françoise and Gokul about Tibetan cinema. And really it was partly coming out of Mike's talk earlier and also Estrella's talk about this idea of a screen world. And I'm just wondering, you know, which clearly is a concept that is still being thought through and developed. And I'm wondering, is Tibetan cinema, or are Tibetan cinemas, plural, can they be thought of as a screen world? Or, you know, because of this block that you talked about at the end of the talk, that makes it very hard for there to be cooperation and circulation and contacts. Is it in fact not possible to think about it as a Tibetan screen world? Would that concept be useful in trying to get beyond this national, transnational, blockage that you were talking about?
If I may, thank you, Chris. Hello, thank you. If I may, maybe Gokul will add something, but I took notes when you mentioned, when Mike talked about the screen worlds on the criteria, and the first one was urban setting. So even if we don't go into politics, if we go into the urban-rural divide, I was thinking, why is urban setting important? Well, because you have screens there. I guess. So this makes sense for screen worlds. And Tibet is highly rural. And of course, there's no independent cinema, halls. And people don't go to the movies. They watch DVDs. It's very new, and it's a habit that has to be still ingrained. And they don't live in an urban environment. Or if it's urban, it's Chinese. And Tibetan films have little room, little spaces in the Chinese world. So because of that, if this is one important criteria, and for Mike, it was the #1 criteria, I don't know if it meant the most important or it just happened to be, the first one, that was a problem. And then screen world, if we talk about festivals, for instance, so, okay, forget about having cinema halls, then screen in festival terms, then we have found instances where the Chinese government opposed the co-presence of China-made Tibetan films and exile-made Tibetan films. So that's another hindrance, towards building a Tibetan screen world. Then I was thinking, okay, Himalayan screen world. Himalaya, maybe cinema, whatever. We have Balkan cinema, we may have, if we talk in regional, non-national terms. But then look at Bhutan is maybe the one Himalayan nation state in the world, and they have a good film industry because they have been helped and supported and groomed by India and Bollywood. And now they're, becoming more, I would say, independent in terms of filmography. But a Tibetan filmmaker, whose name I won't say, asked me if they could make a film in Bhutan because it's less restricted. It's a Buddhist environment that looks like Tibet. And then when I was in Bhutan, I asked, just like that, I said, by the way, would you consider maybe having some, I said, sorry, this person being Tibetan has a Chinese passport and we have to be very careful. We don't do cooperation with Chinese. So then this, festival, screen world, whatever, urban screen, cooperation across the Himalayas is super complicated in the Tibetan case. I don't know if you want to add something real quick.
Yeah, I mean, you covered everything. Like, in the presentation, one of the argument Professor Françoise put forward was actually about, the lack of communication between these two polarities of Tibetan cinema. But in the case of exile, these Tibetan filmmakers are working in different countries, and different countries have different regulations. They have different challenges. They have different film production rules, film production opportunities, and even within the exile cinema, it's very scattered. Bringing them together to one particular forum and calling it Tibetan cinema in exile itself is according to Tibetan filmmakers, is a difficult task. And this lack of communication between these two Tibetan cinemas is something which is very real. For example, like Professor Françoise said, in 2005, when the Silent Holy Stones was actually debuting in the US, in New York, around the same time, Dreaming Lhasa was also screening there, and China was all over there. Forget just US. In India, 2004, there was this Asian Film Festival which was organized. At that time, 2 films made by Tibetan filmmakers in India were not allowed to screen in India. So this is like a constant political pressure that happens in different sorts. So, but at the same time, there might be some kind of dialogue which might be possible within the larger framework of screen world, especially considering that film festival and all that aspect of that particular concept. But again, I have heard from many Tibetan filmmakers in exile that their films are not selected, except Toronto maybe. No other film festivals actually screen their films, and they are finding their own film festivals to screen their cinema. So it's not about the quality of cinema. Of course, there is quality of cinema, but like Professor Françoise said, Bhutanese cinema, for example, Luna and I Ark in the Classroom is an Oscar-nominated film now, but they have similar films made by Tibetan filmmakers in exile. For example, Royal Coffee, which was made in Paris, is a really good film, but it won't get that much amount of audience, except this, again, the marginal film festivals, if I put it right. So, but yeah, there might be dialogue. So I think it's a possibility to look into that. Yeah, I think.
Thank you very much. Do we have other questions? Everybody's hungry here, but can still take one or two more questions. Yeah, so Professor MORITA.
Yeah, so it's really a pity we don't ask any questions to three other speakers. But I believe Estrella is not with us, right?
Yeah, she had to leave.
So I'd like to ask Tamaki and then also Dominic, because we have been talking today about us, of course, different countries, but there's some fairly similar topic. Because after, of course, in Italy, after the fascism, or there's the fall of fascism, probably Italian filmmakers, particularly the neorealists, so-called neorealists, are trying to, they're doing sort of a new identity building, or this new identity of this new nation state. And then also this, Dominic is talking about after Ceausescu, and then the sort of a new, so democracy, so that it's really Romanian filmmakers try to sort of search, this, their sort of national identity and so on. So probably because of the time you didn't really mention, it's how, there's this Italian cinema, also Romanian cinema, during the time of fascism, and then, of course, during the time of Ceausescu, and then, of course, there's probably this, you didn't mention, but what kind of films those Italian and then the Romanian filmmakers were making, and so on, and how fundamentally different there's this nation they presented on the screen as different from sort of nations presented after the fall of fascism and the fall of Ceausescu.
Thank you very much. Would you like to start, Professor Tsuchida?
I don't have a precise, the precise answer because I myself think that it is impossible to define transnational and national, or more specifically to separate them as concepts. As I said at the beginning of my presentation, the national can only be defined in terms of the external. So in Italy, in the case of Italy, maybe Jacques Libre, French filmmaker, said, on the one hand, we have Italian cinema. On the other hand, we have Rossellini. I think each director has his style, and I don't know. I think the film which represent the nationality doesn't exist. So the nationality of a film is solely only based on the combination of productions. Just I don't know this is a correct answer to the question, but I have no idea. Sorry.
Professor Nasta?
Yes, it's a very interesting question. Thank you. I have been developing this in my book on contemporary Romanian cinema, because actually half of the book is about cinema before the new Romanian cinema, because I'm trying to explain that what the new post-communist filmmakers tried to do is a reaction against some kind of highly nationalist cinema, large-scale epics, heritage films. So actually Romanian cinema, as most Eastern countries' cinematographies, was very diverse. So I'm explaining in my book, you had comedies, fiction films for children, animated cinema, genre films. And for the last 15 years in Romania, there was a huge reaction against this mainstream cinema, which actually was quite faithful to the national genome, so you could recognize it. And now they're coming back. So now they're doing more and more very diversified films, which somehow illustrate the nation at large. But what interests me very much in this auteur theory I'm trying to develop is that actually the relationship to history, to politics, to ideology is ever present in those films and not in the mainstream cinema. It's paradoxical, but this is what happens. And I just wanted to have a small bracket coming back to Professor Tsuchida's very interesting paper. It's actually what happened also in Italy, because in Italy, I have been working quite a while on Antonioni's films, and in Italy you had many film directors which became, between inverted commas, neorealists as a reaction to what was going on in the Telefoni Bianchi cinema, but also because they themselves, some of them, I would say most of them, Rossellini the first, were involved in this type of fascist cinema. So they wanted to show at what point they were against it. So I think there are some political paradigms very important to analyze here in terms of national cinema. So thank you for your questions.
Anyway, thank you very much. That's very, very interesting answers, because I listened to your papers because it's great interest, because both of you are saying it's really an auteur. We normally think they project their more personal visions on the screen, but then the result is, and of course, those authors contributed to us and the show, probably new nations, new possibility of interpreting the history and the country and the culture and so on. So that yeah, thank you very much for that. That's wonderful in the papers.
Thank you very much to all of you. I think it's time to wrap up, unless we have a question coming up, but it's 1:10 p.m. here in Belgium, and it's even later in Japan. And I think people want to enjoy their Saturday night. So again, thank you very much to all of you for being with us. Many thanks to Clara, Jean-Louis, and the Arbra Film Company for dealing with all the logistics and much more, actually. Maybe I will leave the concluding word to Professor Morita. You may want to improvise something.
Yeah, okay, so I believe I'm talking too much, and then so on. I made already 2 remarks. And then anyway, thank you very much, everybody, and then staying until the end. And then, of course, I was very, very disappointed so when we decided to make this workshop as a hybrid of this presence and online. And I had been just really looking forward to us coming to Brussels. I'm sure that all of you think that way. But it's in the end, I believe all this workshop turned out as it was a very wonderful workshop. And then I learned a lot. And then also that I mentioned those papers made me think those various things. Anyway, particularly also, as I said in as an opening remark, so I'm glad to keep, so two, some concept, transnational, and then, so transnational and the national cinema, and there's many people that's really talking about one thing, national cinema or, some transnational cinema. But I don't think, that's really, you can't really speak those two things separately. And then I think there's so the transnational cinema and this national cinema intertwined so closely, and so that it is really, I'm glad, because it's people are directly touching on these issues. And then so anyway, thank you very much again. If you allow me, allow us, I'd like to keep your contact address. And then so we are going to send you, see if there is another opportunities come up like this one. And because now our Brussels office is going to be there. And then also, if you get the chance, I'd like to invite you to Japan, and then have another occasion like this. And then also I mentioned this is we are thinking to maybe collect maybe some papers, and then turn them into some probably some anthologies and so on. So probably if you allow us, we are going to get in touch with you near future about the next event and the publication. Okay. Anyway, thank you very much, everybody, and then people in Brussels, please enjoy your lunch, and then people online, and then so go ahead with your lunch or the dinner. Anyways, and thank you very much again. Hopefully, see you somewhere, sometime. So goodbye then.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.